threatened her, her daughter with being an orphan. And Trump this morning is tweeting, no way that that's a made-up story. Well, the question that comes to my mind is, how would he know?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he can't help himself, and when he does this, it goes against him in the case. And again, I think, it's hard to be patient when, the future of the country is at stake, but he keeps tightening, his own circle around him through this investigation and what he's done and what he hasn't done. Yeah. And his own words are going to be used against him.
Yeah. Yeah, there's talk now about a Pence, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, Nikki Haley ticket in 2020. I've seen that in more than one place.
Isn't it interesting what she did? Like, I really think, the fact that, they went after her and tried to throw her under the bus as they're afraid to now execute the sanctions that they've been threatening against Russia, again, for, not that I'm into the Russia narrative. I think, it's actually counterproductive to where we're trying to move towards this fall. But, the fact that they tried to throw her under the bus and she stood up for herself, there's not a lot of Republicans standing up these days. And I found that to be either telling of what they perhaps see is what's coming down the road, and it's going to take these few brave ones to do it first. Yeah,
and I would add, if there is any evidence, and this is what this whole investigation is all about, that Russia interfered in our election, particularly getting into our voting machines or anything like that, but also, at any level, there should be hell to pay. But we need to absolutely know this before. But anyway, let's pick up some phone calls here.
Sure.
Rich in Cedro-Woolley, Washington. You are listening on Sirius XM. Thank you for that. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Morning, Tom, Congressman. I'm 56 years old. I graduated in 1980 from high school. By the time I got out of college, the whole world had gone through a looking glass. I bring this up to point out that there's a whole generation from my age and younger that have grown up in this Reaganomics fishbowl, whether it's the Bush version, the Clinton version, the Obama version, or the Trump version. The fundamentals have not changed. Now, and this is all under the umbrella of Reagan's 9 scary words that are, I'm from the government, and I'm here to help. So when you come out with a slogan like a New Deal, you've got a whole generation that cringes from this scary government program. I would suggest, and I'd like to have your opinion on it, that you go use the politics of fear. Don't attack candidates. Attack the concept of Reaganomics, as in Reaganomics killed the middle class.
Yeah, because we're still in a Reaganomics era. And thank you, Rich. And Congressman, if I can add to that, I had a caller yesterday, and I don't want to forget this, who was a marketing guy, and he was so spot on. If you guys are ever reconsidering your better deal, call it the real deal. People like things that are real. That was when Coke rolled out their new product. It was real Coke. Americans, real is like as red, white, and blue as it gets. Back to you.
Interestingly, just yesterday, Pramila Jayapal from Seattle and myself, Pramila is our first vice chair of the Progressive Caucus, sat down with our 3 people who are in charge of our communications efforts internally, Hakeem Jeffries, David Cicilline, and Sherry Bustos, and we presented to them the poll that we did as a Progressive Caucus. We did a poll in 30 competitive congressional districts around the country and showed that many of the progressive issues that not only work with our base also work with swing voters and swing districts, from issues like health care and corporate power to infrastructure investment and other issues. And one of the things we tested, Tom, that I think is especially important and goes right to Rich's point, is people want us to be bold and not incremental. They don't, just want things to improve a little bit. They want substantial change to the way the system works. And my only slight difference with what Rich is saying is, I don't know if I want to refer to things as Reaganomics, because for a lot of people, they don't remember much about Ronald Reagan.
Sure.
But certainly that, I agree what he's saying, that mentality of how we've now used as the narrative, kind of that, what experience happened during the Reagan era, and how that still is kind of how we go back to talking about it from those terms, is a counterproductive to where we're actually trying to go. I would argue let's just be bigger and bolder on everything we're talking about. Let's make sure we have a real economic agenda, but again, talks about the swamp in a way that includes corporations and Wall Street. Yeah, amen. And a real deal. It's a real deal. Yeah. Okay, Congressman Mark Pocan is with us. It's Middays with Mark on the Thom Hartmann Program. He'll be taking your calls for the hour. He's the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He represents the 2nd District of Wisconsin.
in the U.S. House of Representatives, pocan.house.gov, and Rep. Mark Pocan.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And we'll be right back with more of your calls for Congressman Mark Pocan. And welcome back. Jesse, watching Free Speech TV in Miami, Florida. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Okay. Hey, hi, Tom. Congressman. Hey, I want to pick up on something Tom said before that's very important, and I want to connect it to where you stand on the Chinese intellectual property rights. Tom said he wouldn't mind not having property rights if he had the cure for cancer. Just curing cancer would be motivation enough for him. He wouldn't need a pyramid of money. And the Chinese is pretty much going along with that idea, but Tom says, shouldn't somebody get something for curing cancer? But he backed it up by saying, I really would be happy just curing cancer. So, Congressman, where would you stand on something like that? Because the monopolization of inequality is the biggest reason for wealth inequality in the world now. So where do you stand on the Chinese property rights? Thanks.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's as simple as you're asking, Jesse. If I can just offer a little bit longer on that. First of all, when it comes to prescription drug companies, there's many levels of issues we have, and as it comes to intellectual property, one of the problems are companies are taking the rights they have, the time that expires, and they're finding ways to extend it and extend it and extend it. And yesterday I had a chance to question one of the agencies specifically around insulin, where the cost has gone up tremendously, and they make these little tweaks to stop any generic production. So should people who come up with a cure for cancer get something out of it? Yes, and that is part of why we have intellectual property laws. Here's the interesting statistic, though. The Bayh-Dole Act, which essentially talked about our ability to go back and try to get something if NIH dollars have been used in the finding the cure, so it's not just the research dollars from the company. Interestingly, there's a study that just came out between 2010 and 2016. I think there were 210 drugs, somewhere in that area, approved by the FDA. All of them had NIH research behind them. And I think part of the question is we're already paying for a lot of that research. So they've started to back off saying they're recouping research and development costs, and now they're trying to make a complex formula no one can understand. But there is a greed in the system that we're trying to address. I don't think it's going after someone who, intellectual property-wise, came up with a cure for cancer, deserves the benefit. But when drugs now, some drugs are costing $750,000 for the dosage or $200,000 like ALS, and I have neuroscientists coming in saying, you know, I can't actually give this to a patient who could benefit. That's what we're really trying to address through I think a lot of the work we're doing on prescription drugs. And
did you see the Goldman Sachs internal investment report that was issued earlier this week that said that cures are a bad business model for pharma? They used the example of Gilead Sciences, which developed Harvoni, the anti-Hep C drug. They sold $15 billion worth in the first year. They're down to $4 billion worth now because they've cured most of the Hep C in the country. And they've sucked up all the people who are able to pay $80,000 or whose insurance companies are willing to. And they're saying, you know, really we should be looking at palliative care. You know, it's This is just the short-sightedness of this industry.
And they want to monetize everything, right? And they're going to find every way possible. And, you know, insulin is just a really good example. It's been around for a long, long time. It should have generic equivalents out there, and we're having a battle because they do these little tweaks. So I'm going farther than Jesse's question, but I think it's really where the center of this conversation has to happen.
Yeah, insulin was discovered, what, in the 18th century? 19th century?
And we still can't get generic equivalents.
Right. That's nuts. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls. More right after this. taking your calls for the hour. And Tim in Excelsior, Minnesota. Hey, Tim, thanks for listening to AM 950 there in Minneapolis. You're on the air with Congressman Bocan.
Hey, Tom and Mark, thanks for all you guys do. I'm very active in the DFL party here in Minnesota, and I host a group called Lake Minnetonka Living Liberally. We meet every third Thursday of the month. Actually, tomorrow is our next meeting. And we think we've got a great candidate, Democratic candidate, to replace, we like to call him Evil Eric Paulson here, who's I know you know him, Mark. And I wanted to ask you, how or why wouldn't an incoming congressman, good Democratic congressman, join the Congressional Progressive Caucus? Is it a monetary issue? Is he going to lose lobbying support? Or can you help us with that? Or what's your thought on that, Mark?
Yeah, I think it's a great question to pose to any candidate anywhere in the country, Tim, and I'm glad that you've got a good relationship with the person running in your area. I think often, people, if they join the Progressive Caucus, we're generally the folks that aren't hanging out with the corporate special interest players here in Washington. And, in fact, we're announcing officially today that, we took a vote to no longer take any corporate PAC money in our Progressive Caucus PAC, the first major PAC to do that. And if you look at some of the other caucuses, values-based caucuses, their money almost exclusively comes from those special interests. So sometimes people think that if they are a Progressive Caucus member, they're going to lose the ability to raise money from those outside groups. I might argue the answer is hallelujah. But sometimes people think by joining the Progressive Caucus, they're going to have a disconnect. Now, interesting, I had a very interesting conversation this morning with some people about this. And, the fact that we're about to take the majority, one, we have to be poised to actually get something done so we can do maybe better than we were able to do in 2008 when we were in that same position, although we had a White House as well. But really, the Progressive Caucus, we're in the process of putting together something that's going to essentially recreate the old Democratic Study Group. We're trying to do this great work on our 501c3 so we can analyze bills, work with outside groups, and move an agenda. Any member who's someone who comes into Congress should be strongly considering joining the group that proactively wants to move things forward rather than just give them access to special interest money. And I think, that in many ways is a clear distinction.
Paul in Lucerne, California. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hey, thank you, Congressman, for all your hard work for America. We appreciate it. Now, everybody's giving Donald Trump way too much credit for pardoning Scooter Libby. Personally, I think he just did it out of spite because the FBI director, James Comey, prosecuted Scooter Libby. I think that's all there is to it. And what's all this noise about the Justice Department overstepping their bounds? They subpoenaed those documents, and Trump's lawyer gave them a written summary of those documents. It doesn't take a brain scientist to figure out, okay, it's not going to be long before the FBI is knocking on your door, grabbing those documents.
Okay, Paul, thanks.
Yeah, I think, a lot of, especially here in Congress anyway, Republicans trying to defend the president. First of all, a lot fewer of them are on this because it's really hard to justify. And again, it wasn't, coming from this investigation. It was coming from New York prosecutor, someone appointed by Donald Trump, who went after his personal lawyer with, Donald Trump sometimes says things that are adding to what they're investigating. And, I just, like I said before, the circle is tightening more and more around Donald Trump, his family, and his campaign. And we just have to have that strength of that, I think, behind us to be able to move forward and do some other things. But it's harder and harder for Republicans here to credibly challenge this. I mean, the ones who are the most vocal defenders of Donald Trump are the Tea Party folks, and even they do it with somewhat of a, not necessarily tongue-in-cheek, but they know that they're not necessarily saying something credible that they believe in. They're just trying to defend the White House.
I refer to the Tea Party caucus as the Cokehead caucus because it seems like they're all just direct beneficiaries of the Koch network. Is there we have 30 seconds here.
Yeah.
Is there a future for the Tea Party guys in Congress?
Well, you think about it. If they're going to lose a bunch of seats and a bunch of moderates are announcing they're resigning, they're going to have a greater percent of their caucus, smaller caucus, will be the Tea Party.
Oh my.
So they might have to go through a real period of introspection or implosion, is my guess.
Yeah, and of course, the Koch network, Americans for Prosperity, and all these other groups. This is actually larger and more well-staffed and more well-funded than the Republican Party itself. I don't know why that's not like, yeah, I don't know why that's not like not the top story in the newspaper every single day. You know, we've got, this is oligarchy. Anyhow, Congressman Mark Pocan is with us taking your calls for the hour. We'll be back. It's Middays with Mark here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Back with more of your calls for the Congressman right after this.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And, of course, Congressman Pocan, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus representing Wisconsin. His website, pocan.house.gov. Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from my book, We the People, A Call to Take Back America, which was published back in 2004. This was during the Bush administration. It's an illustrated nonfiction book, and this is from the chapter titled They're Back, page 84. Today, the conservatives are set to complete what the railroad barons pushed the Grant administration to start. That would have been in the 1880s, to take democracy and its institutions of governance, which the founders fought and died for, from the hands of humans, citizens, and voters. They're handing control to the very types of monopolistic corporations the founders fought against when they led the Tea Party revolt against the East India Company in Boston Harbor in 1773. In June of 2003, despite protests from millions of Americans, corporate-friendly Michael Powell's FCC lifted some of the last tattered restrictions on media ownership, allowing absolute concentration of the voices we hear into a tiny number of corporate hands. On another front, a major multinational corporation has claimed the right to deceive people in its PR as its First Amendment right to free speech. The New York Times Corporation editorialized in support. Even the ACLU, unable to see the forest for the trees, adopted a misguided advocacy seeking to preserve First Amendment rights, even for corporations who don't legitimately warrant them. In addition, as much as half the federal workforce is slated to be replaced by corporate workers under a new Bush edict. Keep in mind this was 2004. Government, which doesn't have constitutional human rights of privacy and so is answerable to we the people, will then, once big chunks of government are privatized, will then be able to use Fourth Amendment rights of privacy to hide what those workers do and how they do it from the prying eyes of citizens and voters. In a similar fashion, corporate-owned and thus unaccountable to the people voting machines are being installed nationwide. In the last election, these machines often produced vote results so different from exit polls that pollsters who have been successfully calling elections for over 50 years threw their hands up and closed shop. And in the ultimate irony, the man in charge of the Bush administration's economic policy, Secretary of Treasury John Snow, is a multimillionaire campaign contributor, chairman of the Business Roundtable, an elite core of 100 of the nation's most powerful corporate CEOs, and himself a railroad baron. It's a sorry state of affairs, and it shouldn't be that way. Corporations are created by humans to further the goal of making money. And as engineer, architect, and writer Buckminster Fuller said in his brilliant essay, Grunch of Giants, corporations are neither physical nor metaphysical phenomena. They are socioeconomic ploys, legally enacted game playing. Corporations are non-living, non-breathing legal fictions. They feel no pain. They don't need clean water to drink, fresh air to breathe, healthy food to consume. They can live forever. They can't be put in prison. They can change their identity or appearance in a day. They can change their citizenship in an hour. They can rip off parts of themselves and create entirely new entities. Some have compared corporations to robots in that they are human creations that can outlive individual humans, performing their assigned tasks forever. Scientist and prolific author Isaac Asimov, when considering a world where robots had become as functional and intelligent as, and more powerful than, their human creators, posited 3 fundamental laws that would determine the behavior of such potentially dangerous human-made creations. His 3 laws of robotics stipulated that non-living creations must obey humans and never behave in a way that would harm humans. In some famous fictional scenarios, we see the consequences of letting human creations operate without adequate restrictions or limitations. In Arthur C. Clarke's 2001, the onboard computer HAL seizes control of the spaceship from the humans therein. The Terminator film series depicts a time when human-built machines wage war against humanity itself. And in the Matrix films, machines use humans much as we now use them. Asimov's idea was profound, but not altogether original, of course. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison beat him to it by about 200 years with an idea that a constitutional amendment was needed to ensure that the reach of corporations was limited. Something seems to have slipped since then. Until 1886, it was a felony in most states for corporations to give money to politicians or otherwise try, through either lobbying or advertising, to influence elections. Such activity was called bribery and influencing. And the reason it was banned was simple. Corporations can't vote, so what are they doing in politics? And numerous additional laws were passed to restrain corporations from involvement in politics during the era of President Teddy Roosevelt, who said there can be no effective control of corporations while their political activity remains. In Wisconsin, for example, the penalty for any corporate official violating the law and getting cozy with politicians on behalf of the corporation was 5 years in prison and a substantial fine. Prior to 1886, corporations were referred to in U.S. law as artificial persons, similar to the way Star Trek portrays a human-looking robot named Data. Like Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, state laws like that of Wisconsin prevented corporations from harming humans while still allowing people to create their robots, their corporations, and use them to make money. The Wisconsin law said no corporation doing business in this state shall pay or contribute or offer consent or agree to pay or contribute directly or indirectly any money, property, free service of its officers, employees, or thing of value to any political party, organization, committee, or individual for any political purpose whatsoever. We the people. Helping you win the water cooler wars, it's the Thom Hartmann Program. Welcome back. Middays with Mark. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the Hour on Hour program. Lou in Pueblo, Colorado. You were on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hey, good morning. Mr. Pocan, thanks for publishing the names of the other members of the PCCC, or the Progressive Caucus. I'm now getting nasty grams from the DNC because I don't give them money. I'm giving directly to progressive candidates. I feel much better doing that. But what I was calling about is I think, we need to boil things down to 2 or 3 issues. And I think the reasonable 2 issues that I see, one is 95% of our media being controlled by the right wing, so they control the message and keep producing lies until I see lots of people that believe lies. And the other issue is somehow we've got to 2 major political parties that both pander to the GOP base, ignore the Democratic base, and when they get in office, do nothing for either one. We've got to get somebody who cares about people, normal Americans, and actually takes action. I think those are our 2 campaign issues right there.
Yeah, Lou, I'll tell you. So, first of all, I think one, when you engage the most voters in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, where we lost, the White House essentially with those 3 states, part of what the Democrats lacked was a coherent populist economic message. We didn't articulate that well. So I think, first thing is we still have to focus on those core economic issues, but do it from a progressive, bold, populist standpoint. I mean, Connor Lamb did well in a district that was a Republican district because, honestly, his message was a populist, progressive economic message, and that was the larger part of why he did as well as he did.
Well, if I may, West Virginia, which went 69% to Donald Trump, was swept by Bernie Sanders in the primary.
Yeah, and we've seen this in other parts of the country, right? I mean, people want you to be bold and actually do something, which is how you actually motivate people. I think the second part that you brought up, though, Lou, is the governing question, which is what are we going to do once we get the majority? Are we going to go back to 2008 where we promised EFCA and things to help people have a voice in their workplace and none of that happened? or are we going to be ready for it? So one of the parallel tracks that the Progressive Caucus is working on is recreating policy folks on our 501c3, our nonprofit side, to really do analysis on bills, to come up with ideas for us, to help us work with the outside groups to strategize how to make these things actually become policy. And we kind of have our blueprint in our people's budget that we produce every year. Not that we're not open to new and other ideas, but it's a very, very comprehensive document. But the idea is, how do you make sure that we actually, when we govern, we do what we said or we do what we need to do? And I think that's the part that we can't let opportunity miss. And I think there were some missed opportunities in 2008.
Roy in Sunrise Beach, Missouri. You are on the air with Congressman Mark Pocan.
Congressman, has anybody thought about what Trump has done when he attacked Syria and threw them missiles? Did he get Putin's okay to do that? And he didn't have okay to put sanctions on? That was in place of the sanctions.
So I couldn't tell you if he got okays or things like that. I think that they did reach out and through, from what I understand, they're the channels that they normally communicate through and talked about airspace and things like that. But I can't tell you if he got Putin's okay. But here's the problem. The fact that we're even questioning, with this president and how close he may or may not be to the Russian government, and the fact that they were going to do sanctions and then they pull back on that, and that we have a completely inconsistent foreign policy, not just towards Russia, but I would argue towards the rest of the globe. We have an inconsistent policy coming from this president, is why people are even more puzzled when we take actions and when we don't take actions. And, I don't see that changing in the near future. Maybe if we can, change some of the faces of Congress, we can force the president to have more coherent plans. But, whether it be trade, which is an issue very, very important to me and the people in the upper Midwest, I don't know what the president actually thinks. A week ago, he was talking about getting back in TPP. Now he's saying maybe not. I'm not sure what he's going to say 48 hours from now or 48 days from now. And that's inherently our biggest problem we have with this president.
Absolutely. Dawn in Arlington Heights, Illinois. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi. I just wanted to talk about Foxconn in Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
I don't understand how this is a foreign company coming in, is going to dump a lot more heavy metals into one of the Great Lakes, which is a water source for millions and millions of people. The eminent domain issue where they're throwing people off of their properties, I feel very, very discouraged that this is happening. I mean, I understand on an economic level, but this is a company that's not going to care about America's best interests. There's already been, stories about them hiring people, paying them much lower than what Scott Walker's promising, that 13,000 families are going to actually make a living wage from this. How is this constitutional that they're throwing people off of their property? I don't understand how they're able to get away with it. I really don't trust that they're going to be honest about what they're putting into our water system, as we can see from from situations like Flint, Michigan, or West Virginia with their water issues. How can the government, the state government, the federal government, be okay with these type of situations like Foxconn?
Yeah, this requires a conversation with David Souter, I think. Excuse me, Don.
Well, I mean, this is, in my opinion, Don, the issue that will send Scott Walker into the private sector come November. He is making the largest subsidy that any state has given any company, but as you pointed out, it's not even a domestic company. It's a foreign company, $3 billion, but now we find out it goes beyond a $3 billion subsidy. It's $4.5 billion when you count the local subsidy and the transportation subsidies. So he's giving $4.5 billion to a foreign corporation because he made a promise when he ran 7.5 years ago he was going to create 250,000 jobs in his first 4 years. He's not even at a couple 100,000 7.5 years after that promise. So he was desperate to get his numbers up. And when you say 13,000, that's Scott Walker's line. The company even says 3,000. They're saying aspirationally 13,000, but they're talking 3,000 jobs. So the more you divide this up, this is an extremely large subsidy to a foreign corporation, and as you said, next to the Great Lakes, going to use a great abundance of our fresh water, and there's a lot of environmental concerns. Bottom line, Dawn, is This issue is toxic in Wisconsin. This is based on polling and focus groups I've seen, as well as anecdotally as I talk to people. I think this is the issue that'll bring someone who wanted to be a national player like Scott Walker down, and maybe it'll be a message to every other governor that we don't have to do these giant race-to-the-bottom subsidies to attract companies. Instead, if we invest in people and giving people job skills and things like that, that's the real way to attract business, and it's not through just giving these tax breaks away and letting them do anything they want once they come in order to create a job.
That's amazing. 3,000 jobs, $3 billion. That's $3 million. That's $1 million a job.
Well, and it's really 4.5 because of the other subsidies. And luckily, the reporters are reporting it that way back home because it is $4.5 billion.
Well, that's a good thing. Mike in Belfont, Pennsylvania. Mike, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Okay, yes. I wanted to talk about the arrests of the gentleman in Philadelphia. It's a big issue here.
In the Starbucks.
I'm a retired attorney and community organizer, and I'm stunned that the media isn't talking about public accommodations because that 1964 law invalidates state trespass laws in places like Starbucks. A whole generation of people don't know they have an absolute right not to be hustled out by local police under trespass laws.
Yeah, and hopefully this is raising it. Unfortunately, it sometimes takes a bad decision like was made by the Starbucks here to bring us to the point that we're actually having a conversation about this and maybe educate people. I will give them credit that I think they're closing down for a period of time to make sure everyone is being trained, and they're doing it in a rather fast way compared to how most corporations operate. But, you know, all too often, you know, the law may say something, but how it's actually practiced is different, and you need an incident, unfortunately, to really wake people up. And hopefully this incident is now an education for people across the country on what public accommodations really means.
David in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hey, Congressman. I had a statement and wanted to get your thoughts on something. The momentum that the progressives has gained in the last since Trump has come into office has been, you know, in my opinion, pretty substantial. And I would argue that we wouldn't be seeing this type of activity of progressives if Hillary Clinton was elected. And I wanted to get your thoughts on, do you think that Donald Trump was probably the best thing that could have happened to the progressive movement?
You know,
it's the Susan Sarandon theory.
Yeah, I mean, I personally just find it hard to find anything, you know, positive, although I do try to find silver linings and things. He certainly has highlighted what the full extent of what happened with the gerrymandering in 2010 and taking us to a point that we're at where we're at today, which is all the devastation that comes out of elections have consequences, right? And has this woken people up? Absolutely. We're seeing it across the country in every special election, from legislators to other things. So it certainly has done that purpose, and maybe it ended the pendulum that was moving right with the 2010 elections. But, you know, I think of all the damage that happened along the way, so it's hard for me to argue that there's something good about Donald Trump getting elected, other than maybe it was the final catalyst we needed to move things back to where we need to.
Yeah, so sort of, yeah, but the price was way too high.
A lot. It's a big price.
There you go. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour here on Middays with Mark on the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be back with more of your calls for the Congressman in just a moment.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And Congressman Pocan's website, pocan.house.gov, and you can tweet him at Rep, R-E-P, as in Representative, Rep Mark Pocan. And welcome back. Victor, watching Free Speech TV in Neenah, Wisconsin. Victor, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yes, thank you for taking the call. I have a question that who should we vote for governor in Wisconsin this fall? A Democrat, of course. And I think you should run for president in 2020, Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Victor. I appreciate your kind thoughts on that. I think we're going to have a slew of people to run, and we'll have a lot of good options. And, people are ready. I mean, Donald Trump has proven we need to take care of this. But in Wisconsin, Tom, we have right now 16 people who are currently, and actually it might have gone back up to 17 now. I think someone else got in the race. So we have a big primary. I personally, Victor, am staying out of it. My goal is to make sure that none of our candidates go after each other, that the goal is to beat Scott Walker, and that people are very cognizant of that. We just started our nomination paper process. I'm guessing out of the 17, maybe 13 will actually file in the end. But what's most important for me is that there is an operation to make sure that whoever wins the primary, they're positioned with a campaign operation and resources to make sure they can beat Scott Walker. And this Foxconn issue, as you probably know very well from Nina up in the Fox Valley, that this is a toxic issue up there because no one's going to see money and they're all going to be paying for it up there. So, find the candidate that agrees that your value is the best, help support them in any way. But at the end of the day, I mean, I don't see a lot of bad candidates in the field. I think we've got some good options, but more importantly, and this is in primaries across the country, I think, when we get personal and attack each other within primaries in a negative, nasty way, we injure ourselves, and we need to remember who we're trying to beat. And I think that's just an important concept no matter where you live.
McWayne in Chino Valley, Arizona, watching Free Speech TV. McWayne, we have a minute and a half to the break. A quick question for Congressman Pocan?
Yeah, Congressman. Perhaps rather than Reaganomics, we call it Republicanomics, whose founding principle is the rich haven't enough and the poor have too much, and whose mission statement is prosperity for the plutocrats. Thank you.
Yeah, McWayne, I thank you, because I do think we can't just call it Reaganomics. Here's the other thing I would argue from the polling we took, and just yesterday I heard Slinda Lake, who's a good pollster, talk about this, but the idea is Trump was onto something when he talked about the swamp. People do feel that there's a lot of the system is rigged against them. But what they consider the swamp, not just this Washington thing that actually Donald Trump just built a high-rise condo on the swamp, but they consider the swamp to include the big banks and the big corporations. When we say it that way, people completely agree. They know that that system is rigged against them, and the special interests have too much influence in state capitals and the U.S. Capitol. So I hope we're bold enough and brave enough to say it that way, and if we are, I think it's going to put us in a lot better position in November.
We have 30 seconds, Congressman. How would a Democrat message that in a bumper sticker, essentially?
I don't know if it's so much in a bumper sticker, but we have to accept that the system is rigged against the average person. I mean, Bernie Sanders probably said it best when he ran for president, which is why he did as well as he did, even though he wasn't a Democrat in a Democratic primary, right? He resonated with people, and to some degree Donald Trump did, but from the other side. What we are seeing, though, is it is those big corporations and the special interests and their influence. And I've seen polling from End Citizens United, and people are starting to connect that with campaign finance as well.
Yeah. Congressman Mark Pocan with us, Middays with Mark, taking your calls. Leslie in Oak Park, Illinois. Hey, Leslie, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Oh, thank you very much for being on the air and giving us all this good information.
Of course.
With Paul Ryan exiting, What do we know about this Bryce guy and Kathy Meyer that may be running for his seat as Democrats? And who do you think the Koch brothers are going to pick on the Republican side?
Sure. So Randy Bryce has gotten a national profile, I think, in his campaign. He's raised about $5 million, sitting on at least $2.5 million. I think he's the dominant candidate in that primary. Kathy Myers is a teacher who's run a race, but just, sometimes politics is about timing, and Randy's race has kind of captured people's imaginations, so he is the forerunner in that race and running, I think, an excellent race, and is a real contrast in that district to whatever Republican they put up. The Republican side, it's interesting because a lot of their mainstream candidates are not running. In fact, one of them even said something like, I don't want to be in the minority in Congress, which tells us a lot as they're saying that. They have the former driver for Paul Ryan, who now is a corporate lawyer in Janesville, Paul's hometown, is running. He serves on the Board of Regents, but very low profile. No one knows him. I assume Nayland, who's kind of a xenophobic, racist sort of candidate, is still going to stay in the primary, and there could be one other addition, but it looks like they're solidifying behind this corporate lawyer. I would love to see that iron worker against a corporate lawyer in a district that's had a lot of deindustrialization. A lot of people used to make cars, and tens of thousands of people used to make cars, and they don't today. So that's what we're looking at. That's one of those seats across the country, and the 23 seats we need to pick up, that if you pick up, puts us one step closer to actually changing who's in the majority in Congress and making sure we have a real goalie to stop the president from what he's doing.
Kerry in Seattle, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan. Kerry?
Yeah, my question was that we, Representative Mocan, the new War Powers Act. It's the same old War Powers Act, but even more gives more power to go after these guys like Al Qaeda and everybody all over the world. But it seems like we created these groups in the Mideast by invading the Mideast, and now we're increasing it where we can chase them all over the world. I'm just wondering, I got 3 beautiful grandkids and 2 are boys, and I'm telling them the truth about what's going on in the United States and how we're losing the Constitution here. I believe Article 1, Section 8 or whatever it is, says that only you guys can declare war. Now we've created these monsters in the Mideast, and now we're chasing them all over the world. We're paying for it. We're sending our kids there to be butchered. No thanks. No thanks. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I'm just wondering what the hell happened here. Thank you, Congressman.
Yeah, Kerry, I completely agree with what you're saying. And so often we get involved in these parts of the world we don't have a lot of expertise. Sometimes I think what we do is actually counterproductive to our goals. In fact, almost not more than often, but quite often that's true. But in this particular case, we need, the Constitution clearly says Congress has to be involved unless it's in self-defense. And they're taking a very wide interpretation of a fairly loose AUMF that was done right after 9/11. And now the new one that's proposed is also unending. And I think none of this is in the best interest of our country, and certainly doesn't represent people, because you at least can then elect or unelect your member of Congress if they're not representing you. And when we give these open-ended ones to any president, you're far more removed from that decision. So we're going to do our best to try to make an argument for a smarter, better AUMF that's far tighter, and that makes us have to go back to the Constitution, which says Congress has to be involved, because there are far better diplomatic solutions than we've seen happen by a variety of people.
Okay, we got a little more than a minute left. Ralph in Tobyhanna, Pennsylvania, got a quick question for Congressman Pocan?
Sure. Who's investigating the post office and the Amazon deal? How come that's still allowed to flourish?
I'm sorry.
He said, who's investigating the post office and the Amazon deal? Why is that allowed to flourish? I'm guessing he's believing Trump.
I heard the Pope, and that's why. Thank you. I was like, I'm not sure where the Pope was here. Well, this is one where, Trump's just wrong, right? Everything he's saying about the actual operation of Amazon and the post office, that's the profitable side. Where we're killing our post office is making them prepay their pensions 75 years into the future, the only agency that has to. But part of Donald Trump is doing this because the person who owns Amazon also owns the Washington Post, and he just doesn't like the coverage. So that's what's going on. But also, there have been people like Darrell Issa and others in the Republican Party that have been moving to try to privatize that for a long, long time. And a lot of the things they've done, I would argue, have made the post office less successful. So what we need to do is maybe expand some of the things the post office does and make it continue to work well, rather than cutting back days of delivery and doing some of the other proposals that are out there. And Donald Trump will jump on some of these just because he feels like it's a way to go after the Washington Post, and that's the complete wrong reason for him doing everything he's doing.
Yeah, as is so often the case.
Yeah.
Congressman Pocan, thank you so much for being with us today.
Sure, thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
Great talking with you as always. You can find Congressman Pocan's website at pocan.house.gov, P-O-C-A-N. His Twitter handle is RepMarkPocan. So check it out. We'll be right back coming up on the top of the hour here, and Sarah Burris is going to be with us right after this about the exposure the Republicans have, shall we say.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.
It's
the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Legacy of Secrecy, The Long Shadow of the JFK Assassination by Lamar Waldron and me. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, triggered cover-ups by officials, this is from the introduction, by the way, that continue to negatively impact American politics, life, and foreign policy. Legacy of Secrecy details those cover-ups and hidden investigations, many for the first time, including the reasons they were carried out under such intense secrecy. Most were spawned by John and Robert Kennedy's top-secret 1963 plan to stage a coup against Fidel Castro, a plan so highly classified that it only started to be exposed in 2005 and is finally revealed in this book. Their own confessions now show the three mafia bosses, Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and Johnny Roselli, were behind JFK's assassination. They used parts of the secret coup plan to kill JFK in a way that forced Attorney General Robert Kennedy, President Lyndon B. Johnson, excuse me, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and high CIA official Richard Helms to withhold critical information not only from the public and the press, but also from each other and sometimes their own investigators. It's important to keep in mind that JFK was murdered just a year after the tense nuclear standoff during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The main goals of U.S. officials were to prevent a nuclear confrontation with the Soviets and to protect JFK's ally high up in the Cuban government, Commander Juan Almeida, head of the Cuban Army in 1963, still listed as Cuba's #3 official today. While U.S. leaders have managed to prevent a confrontation with Russia and preserve a critical ally in the Cuban government, this limited the investigation into JFK's murder, allowing the three mafia chiefs and their associates to remain free. As a result, the long shadow of secrecy surrounding both JFK's murder and the coup plan set the stage for the murder of Martin Luther King, ultimately driving two presidents from office and bringing about the murders of 5 congressional witnesses in the mid-1970s. Legacy of Secrecy breaks excuse me, important new ground in key areas, detailing for the first time Louisiana Godfather Carlos Marcello's clear confession to ordering JFK's assassination. Marcello's criminal empire ranged from Dallas to Memphis, and previously secret files at the National Archives have shown that he made this confession in 1985 to an FBI informant ruled credible by a federal judge as part of a secret FBI undercover sting operation named Camtex. Exposed here for the first time, Camtex yielded Marcello's admission that he'd met Lee Harvey Oswald and set Jack Ruby up in business in Dallas. The operation also generated hundreds of hours of heretofore secret prison audio tapes of Marcello discussing his crimes, recorded using the FBI informant's bugged transistor radio. Yet the FBI and Justice Department withheld most of that information from the public and Congress for years until its revelation in this book. Carlos Marcello wasn't the only mob boss who confessed his involvement in JFK's murder to a trusted associate. Legacy also uncovers important new information about Marcello's partners in JFK's assassination, Tampa Godfather Santos Trafficante and Johnny Roselli, the Chicago Mafia's man in Las Vegas and Hollywood. Shortly before their deaths, both mobsters admitted their roles in JFK's murder to their attorneys. 2 of their associates with documented ties to the secret JFK Almaheda coup plan likewise confessed. Using exclusive new information supported by FBI files apparently withheld from Congress, this book names 2 of the Georgia men who paid James Earl Ray to kill the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, white supremacist Joseph Miltier and Hugh R. Spake. Miltier, who had been involved in Marcello's murder of JFK, was part of a small clique of racists in Atlanta who used Marcello to broker the contract to murder Dr. King. We document James Earl Ray's ties to Marcello's heroin smuggling operation and long overlooked evidence in FBI files linking Ray to Marcello's associate, Johnny Roselli. Finally, this book explains why Ray, while fleeing to Canada the day after killing Dr. King in Memphis, made a 400-plus mile detour south to Atlanta, where he contacted Spake to get help from Miltier. In 1979, the last congressional committee to investigate the murders of JFK and Dr. King, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, concluded, quote, that Trafficante, like Marcello, had the motive, means, and opportunity to assassinate President Kennedy, end of quote from the congressional report. The HSCA had been created in the wake of Roselli's sensational murder, but the HSCA was unable to establish direct evidence of Marcello's complicity. And the same was true for Trafficante and Roselli, because the CIA, FBI, and other federal agencies withheld so many relevant files. The HSCA, headed by civil rights figure Louis Stokes, also concluded there was a likelihood of conspiracy in the assassination of Dr. King and that financial gain was James Earl Ray's primary motivation. But they were unable to determine who had paid Ray or how the conspiracy had worked because the FBI and other agencies had hid critical files. With the help of more than 24 associates of John and Robert Kennedy, backed up by thousands of recently released documents at the National Archives, many of which are quoted here for the first time, Legacy tells the full story denied to Congress and the American people, Legacy of Secrecy. They're right in all the world's
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and on the line with us is Sarah Burris. Sarah is a writer for rawstory.com. She writes about digital issues, politics, and is an expert on the millennial generation. Her Twitter handle is Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, Burris, B-U-R-R-I-S, or at rawstory as well. And the website, of course, rawstory.com. Sarah, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You wrote, thanks for joining us. You wrote a fascinating piece. Here are 6 major facts that spell the downturn, or downfall, excuse me, of the Republican Party. And some would say, oh, gee, that's kind of self-evident. You know, you get young people and you get the browning of America and all this. But you go a whole lot deeper into this than any of these things I've seen before. And I wanted to get you on to highlight some of these details. For example, you know, I'm a member of the baby boom generation. And so throughout my life, I've seen the impact of a generational bulge, you know, a demographic bulge on the country. And the millennials are actually a larger generation than even the boomers.
Yeah, we're mostly the children of baby boomers. And because you guys decided to have more than one kid, that's why we're bigger.
There you go. Or more than 2. Yeah, so the 83 million millennials, whereas there's only 76 million baby boomers and 65 million members of Gen X. What, in your mind, what is the biggest take-home from this article and this research that you did for this article?
I think the most important thing is that there's a way that Democrats can capture the next election, and I would say any election ahead of them, but only if they do the outreach, if they do the work, if they ask for votes from young voters and get them to the polls.
I was surprised you've got a graphic in your article that's from the Circle analysis of national exit polls 72 to 2016, and it shows that in the Reagan era, 84, the re-election of Reagan, 84, 88, the election of George Herbert Walker Bush, and then 92. Well, actually, it was just those 2, 84 and 88. Young people, now obviously not the millennial generation, but you know the equivalent of that era. I guess they would be Gen Xers or Gen Yers now. Actually voted in pretty substantial numbers, like 20% more of them voted for Republicans than for Democrats. But since then, the number of young people voting for Republicans has just been collapsing. Tell us about this.
Yeah, I think what happened in the 80s was everybody was voting for Ronald Reagan. You can see it when you look at the electoral map. It's just absurd how many people voted for him. So I'm not really surprised that you saw young people voting for Republicans back then. But the second you had Bill Clinton appealing to young voters on MTV, that was the first time you really saw a president in a long time reach out to young people. And that has continued over the years, predominantly with Barack Obama, who ran in 2008, who had a robust program that reached out to young people. So, you know, I think the values of young people have always been such that it makes sense that they lean a little bit more progressive. They're pro-LGBT rights, they're anti-racism. All of these things have become more democratic values, whereas in the past, I think both sides would say, you know, nobody wants to be a racist.
Well, or on the other hand, back in 1964, there was bipartisan opposition, Southern Democrats, Northern Republicans, to civil rights. I mean, this is, you know, from the era of the mid-50s until the, you know, the mid-70s, I would say that dynamic was going on.
And then everything just flipped.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I thought was fascinating about your article, or one of the other things, there's a couple more, was you went through the issues. And the one thing I don't understand about this graphic, it says, do you oppose or favor the following issue stands? And then, and I'll share those numbers in just a second, but then off to the right, it says reps, R-E-P-S, and there's percentages. What was that reps? What does that indicate?
So I think the graphic that you're talking to is the one from Harnstead Strategic Research. That was a couple of years ago. And it shows, I think that's the general population, and it shows the difference between young people versus everybody else.
I see. Okay. So just to go through these numbers, the first one, 80% of young people, of millennials, believe that utilities should be required to generate a third of their power from renewables by 2030, 11, 12 years from now. That's quite substantial, particularly given that during the Reagan era, the pushback on that, which would have been bought by a lot of Democrats, is, oh, you want the government to pick winners and losers?
And we're starting to see that now in red states. I'm originally from Oklahoma, and a couple of years ago, we passed a law, I think, not necessarily banning, but significantly taxing solar panels. And now the way that they subsidize wind energy in Oklahoma is significantly less than the way they do oil and natural gas. So, and one of the fixes they tried to come up with for the teacher strike was taking away the tax bracket or the tax break that they give to wind energy companies. So it's just like all of these governments, are opposing clean energy, and it's not okay with young people. I think we recognize that gas runs out, but wind is forever, especially in Oklahoma.
Yeah, and apropos of that, also, there are consequences of not using green energy, and that is, global climate change. And the number two thing, 79% of young people think that we should reduce carbon pollution to deal with climate change and global warming. And here's the 78% of young people think that we should ban corporations from spending unlimited money in election campaigns, which means overturning actually now 3 Supreme Court decisions.
Wouldn't that be amazing?
It would.
It's the little things. It's the little things in life at this point.
It really would. But I mean, how different is that? Are these numbers, 80, 79, 78%, roughly 80% support for renewables, for dealing with climate change, and for getting corporations, who are the ones who are screwing up the conversation about climate change with their phony research and their phony, it's a debate stuff. How is that different from just 10, 15, 20 years ago? Or do we not know?
I think now it's more overt. I think we've seen in full force what an election looks like whenever you have third-party sketchy companies come in and name themselves something absurd, like Patriots United or Faith United or something like that seems super patriotic. And then all of a sudden, it turns out that they're crazy right-wing nut bars.
Yeah.
So, the result has been a series of elections now where even if millennials were not of age to vote, they've still been watching. And I talked too in this article about the insane consumption of media from young people. Most young people get their media from social media. They get their news, they get all of their information from social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or miscellaneous. And the result of that has been that there's just so much, and so many young people are now more informed, which is a good thing. And so they have these political opinions that are not necessarily based on their parents the way that young people used to base their political values on.
Yeah. And some of the other topics, these were all more than 50%, 70, 69, and 66% respectively. Legalizing same-sex marriage for gay and lesbian couples, leaving the decision on abortion up to the woman, and legalizing small amounts of marijuana for recreational use. These are all over 66%, roughly 70% approval on all of these. This really should define, I think it should define the future of the Democratic Party, at least position-wise.
It should, and those numbers are from 2014. Just to give you an idea of how that, I imagine that they're much higher today, particularly when it talks about legalization for marijuana.
Yeah.
Because you're seeing that nationally, where people, even like my parents of all people, are okay with legalizing marijuana. So I think it's just a completely different way of looking at government and at policy that the way that the Democratic Party has been doing so far. Thus far, it seems like anything goes. Everybody wants to welcome everyone and have a big tent and be accepting of anti-choice candidates, be accepting of homophobic candidates and all of the above. And it's just that's not what young people want to see.
Yeah, it's not going to work in the future for the Republican Party. Sarah Burris, brilliant writing, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Her piece is titled, "Here Are the 6 Major Facts That Spell the Downfall of the Republican Party." It's over at rawstory.com. We'll be back. Stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I want to get into some issues around the economy and around race, and also we'll be picking up your phone calls. Pretty much whatever you'd like to talk about today, give us a shout. And welcome back, Omar. Whoop, there's Omar. Omar in Herndon, Virginia. Hey, Omar. Thanks for calling,
Tom.
and thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind?
Yes, Tom, thank you so much for taking my call. I just want to talk about two issues today. You know, with this whole situation going now with Facebook, do you think, do we need fairness doctrine for the Internet or for
I think that we need some substantial regulation, and a starting point would be what even the folks at Facebook have acknowledged they might be willing to consider. Not that they should run the show, but which is that the same transparency rules that apply to television and newsprint apply to online media. In other words, if you, Omar, are running a campaign for whether it's your own campaign or you're running it for somebody else, for House of Representatives or something like that, and you buy a TV ad, you have to say, this ad brought to you by Omar for House of Representatives. If you print an ad in the newspaper, you have to say at the bottom of that ad, this ad paid for by Omar for Congress. And so, but on the other hand, if you put it on Facebook, you don't have to say anything, and there's something fundamentally wrong with that. So that is like the smallest, most inconspicuous starting point, is just simply requiring transparency.
Sure, absolutely. And the other thing I wanted just to mention, I really think Sean Hannity, him consulting Cohen regarding an issue, I think it has to do with infidelity, because if you look at all the people who are represented, Trump and the other Republican communication director or something, they were all retained because they have some issue with fidelity, where they had an affair with a porn star or something. So I think that's probably what Sean Hannity is hiding. That's just my conspiracy. Thank you for taking my call.
Yeah, you're welcome, Omar. Thanks a lot for the call. And I think that probably a lot of Americans, looking at this situation going, okay, let's see. Michael Cohen has 3 clients. One of them, he negotiated a $1.6 million payment to a woman for a very wealthy Republican number 2 guy in the Republican Finance Committee, who a multi-millionaire, who wanted this Playboy bunny to commit to be exclusively monogamous with him for a year, even though he has a wife and kids, and he was not required to be monogamous. And in exchange for that, she was paid $1.6 million, plus got an abortion. That's client number 1. Client number 2 is Donald Trump. And on behalf of Donald Trump, he was negotiating, this $130,000 settlement with Stormy Daniels, and $100,000, I recall, settlement with, what was her name, Karen McDougal? Yeah, Karen McDougal, and we don't know who else there might be. I mean, this was, one of the subjects of the Mueller subpoena, and it'll be interesting to see if this is a replay of the Bill Clinton thing. And number 3 was Sean Hannity. It's like, hey, wait a minute, you basically hire a lawyer who is an expert in the area that you're hiring the lawyer for. And Michael Cohen does not handle Donald Trump's real estate deals. He handles his infidelity problems, to use your phrase, Omar. So I suspect that, and this is why Hannity is aggressively saying no third parties. So it might be that Hannity just, well, what I don't understand is why both Hannity and Cohen asked that Hannity's use of Cohen as a lawyer be suppressed in court. That's the thing that makes no sense to me. If he had just asked him for some advice on a real estate deal, sure, let the prosecutors see it. It's innocent. Anyhow, we'll be right back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. I want to do this this riff on race relations in our schools and all this other stuff and how it all ties together. I'm going to talk a little more softly than I normally do because it's almost like whatever I had in Honolulu, at least with regard to my voice, is creeping back on me, and I'm trying not to go down that road of losing my voice again. But let me start at the beginning. One of the things we know about our schools since the Reagan era, since Bill Bennett was Reagan's Secretary of Education, and he was basically, you know, a Betsy DeVos, or Betsy DeVos is basically Bill Bennett, trying to cut back on federal funding for public schools in the United States and promote for-profit schools, segregated schools. Well, back then it was segregated schools. I'm not sure there's that much of that still going on, but still, he was promoting these bizarre ideas to basically kneecap public education, to turn education into a profit center for Reagan's billionaire buddies. And the result of that is that many of the schools in America right now are using 30-year-old textbooks. They're using textbooks that were published back in the 1990s or even before in some cases. And the result of that is that students are not getting information that comports with contemporary perspectives, with modern perspectives. And they are getting, you know, bizarre misinformation. For example, Eileen Curtright tweeted this on the 16th of April. She said, "My daughter's history book explains that saying slavery was bad is too simplistic, and many slaves were probably fine with it." And then she quotes from the book. I mean, shows an actual photo of a page from her daughter's American history book, or American civics book, which, by the way, was published in the early 1990s. Quoting from the book, "But the peculiar institution, as Southerners came to call it, like all human institutions, should not be oversimplified. While there were cruel masters who maimed and even killed their slaves, although killing and maiming slaves was against the law in every state, there were also kind and generous owners. The institution was as complex as the people involved. Though most slaves were whipped at some point in their lives, a few never felt the lash. Nor did all slaves work in the fields. Some were house servants or skilled artisans." No reference here, by the way, to, you know, kind of what happened to Sally Heming. I mean, the house servants were the ones most likely to be sexually abused. Anyhow, many may not have even been terribly unhappy with their lot, for they knew no other. But certainly others were, as the Nat Turner revolt revealed. And then they go back into this, and it's like, really? You know, tearing families apart, selling family members, keeping people in bondage. I mean, literally enslaved. It was like, oh, the happy slaves, right? You can draw a direct line from that to what happened in Barstow, California a couple days ago. Barstow, California police officers fired what sounded like more than 30 bullets into a car in Walmart's parking lot, killing Deontay Butchie Yarber, 26, and shooting two other passengers, including 23-year-old Marion Tafoya, who was critically wounded. The incident occurred on the morning of April 5th when Yarber, the father of three girls ages 9, 7, and 1, drove his cousin and friends to the local Walmart. The police saw their car coming and thought he was being aggressive toward them. And so they just opened fire and took out this guy's windshield and killed him. And I don't know if his girlfriend is still alive or not. She was critically wounded. And of course, the police account of things is, well, you know, we just didn't know what their intentions were. It was a car full of black people. So a direct line from these BS stories about slavery that we're teaching white kids in our schools to this kind of thing. A direct line from these BS stories in our schools to this from Carl Frisch I got this morning in the email. Bigots win. The Senate votes to let the car industry continue charging black people more than white people. If the House follows the Senate's lead, auto loan markups with extreme racial disparities will continue. And by the way, the co-sponsors of the bill took at least $5 million from the car industry. So the car industry buys legislators, and the Senate passed this thing. This is nuts, right? This is just absolutely nuts that the Senate passed this bill that stops the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from protecting people of color who are trying to buy cars. No, we can't have that. They should be paying more, don't you know? I mean, this is where we're at. This is today's Republican Party. This is the kind of history that they're promulgating. This is acceptable in our schools, in our society? I don't think so. Back with your calls after this.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with your calls and more of the news of the day right after this. Welcome to the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat, The True Story of the White Nation by J. Sakai, published by Morningstar Press in 1989. This is from Chapter 2, The Foundations of Settler Life. The life of European settlers and the class structure of their society was abnormal because it was dependent upon a foundation of conquest, genocide, and enslavement. The myth of the self-sufficient white settler family clearing the wilderness and supporting themselves through their own initiative and hard labor is a propaganda fabrication. It is the absolute characteristic of settler society to be parasitic, dependent upon the super-exploitation of oppressed peoples for its style of life. Never has Euro-American society completely supported itself. This is the decisive factor in the consciousness of all classes and strata of white society from 1600 to now. Settler society was raised up above the level of backward old Europe by a foundation of conquest. This conquest was a miracle drug for a Europe convulsed with the reaction of decaying feudalism and deadly capitalism. Shot into the veins of the Spanish feudal nation, for instance, the miracle drug of the New World conquest gave Spain the momentary power to overrun North Africa, Holland, and Italy before her historical incident waned. Like many such fixes for Euro-Americans, this conquest was addicting. It was habit-forming and rapidly indispensable, not only culturally, but in the mechanism of an oppressor society whose lifeblood was new conquest. We'll examine this later in the relationship of settlerism to imperialism. For now, it's enough to see that this conquest is a material act of great magnitude, an economic and social event as important as the emergence of the factory system or the exploitation of petroleum in the Middle East. We stress the obvious here because the Euro-American settlers have always made light of their invasion and occupation, although the conquered territory is the precondition for their whole society. Traditionally, European settler societies throw off the propaganda smoke screens that they didn't really conquer and dispossess other nations. They claim with false modesty that they merely moved into vacant territory. So the early English settlers depicted America as empty, a howling wilderness, unsettled, sparsely populated, just waiting with a vacant sign on the door for the first lucky civilization to walk in and claim it. Theodore Roosevelt wrote defensively in 1900, quote, "The settler and pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages," end of quote. It is telling that this lie is precisely the same lie put forward by white Afrikaner settlers who claim that South Africa was literally totally uninhabited by any Africans when they arrived from Europe. To universal derision, these European settlers claim to be the only rightful historic inhabitants of South Africa. Or we can hear similar defenses put forward by the European settlers of Israel, who claim that much of the Palestinian land and buildings they occupy are rightfully theirs, since the Arabs had allegedly decided to voluntarily abandon it all during the 1948-49 war. Are these kinds of tales any less preposterous than those put forward by Euro-American settlers? America was spacious and sparsely populated only because the European invaders destroyed whole civilizations and killed off millions of Native Americans to get the land and profits they wanted. We all know that when the English arrived at Virginia, for example, they encountered an urban, village-dwelling society far more skilled than they were in the arts of medicine, agriculture, fishing, and government. This civilization was reflected in a chain of 300 Indian nations and peoples stretching from the Arctic Circle to the tip of South America, many of whom had highly developed societies. There was, in fact, a greater population in these Indian nations in 1492 than in all of Western Europe. Recent scholarly estimates indicate that at the time of Columbus, there were 100 million Indians in the hemisphere, 10 million in North America, 25 million in Central Mexico, and an additional 65 million elsewhere in Central and South America. These numbers have long been concealed since they give rise to the logical question of what happened to this great mass of people. The European invaders, Spanish, Dutch, English, Portuguese, and French, simply killed off millions and millions to safeguard their conquest of the land and provide the disposable slave labor they needed to launch their new world. Conservative Western historical estimates show that the Spanish reduced, in quotes, the Indian population of their colonies from some 50 million to only 4 million by the end of the 17th century. And from the 10 million Indians who once inhabited North America, after 4 centuries of settler invasion and rule, there were in 1900 perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 surviving descendants in the United States. This was the very substantial down payment towards the continuing blood price that third world nations have to pay to sustain the Euro-American way of life. So when we hear that the settlers pushed out the Indians or forced the Indians to leave their traditional hunting grounds, we know that these are just code phrases to refer politely to the most barbaric genocide imaginable. It could well be the greatest crime in all of human history. Only here, the Adolf Eichmanns and Heinrich Himmlers had names like Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Jackson. The point is that genocide was not an accident, not an excess, not the unintended side effect of virile European growth. Genocide was the necessary and deliberate act of the capitalists and their settler shock troops. The book Settlers. It's the place where we dare to ask, is Walmart a person? And we dare to say, no, I don't care what the Supreme Court says. It's a corporation, is not a person. Come on, give me a break. John in Charleston, South Carolina. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Well, I got a question for you. I was listening to some of the things you were talking about regarding slavery and what's going on in today's society. I guess what the media doesn't talk about is that slavery was brought to this country by the Africans. Slavery was a common practice.
John, I'm sorry, I'm not even going to go there. Yes, there was slavery in some African countries. Yes, there was slavery in Rome. Yes, there was slavery in Greece, and I suppose you could argue that there were some practices in Europe at the time that were close to that, indentured. But none of that, slavery was brought to North America, period, by white people. White people made the choice to go to Africa and start kidnapping people or engaging local people, and yes, most of them were probably black people, but engaging local people in their crime. That would not have happened without white Europeans. So that is the most disingenuous, BS, racist argument I was going to say I've ever heard, but I've heard it my entire life. This is what white people tell themselves very comfortably. Oh, it wasn't us. It wasn't my ancestors. It was those. It was. They're not the victims. They're the perpetrators. Don't you get it? So this is the message that racist whites hang on to in order to justify their racism, and it's terrible. Judd in Las Vegas. Hey, Judd, what's up?
Hey, how you doing, Tom?
I'm well. What's on your mind?
Nice to talk to you today. I was just listening to your part about the loans and the CFPB allowing these horrible rates on auto loans for people of color.
Yep.
And last August, I met a young lady at my doctor's office, and we've been seeing each other for several months now, and she had this car loan I've been helping her out with, and I couldn't believe when I finally got on the phone and talked to this company. Well, I was trying to figure things out, and now I got to try to get it refied. But I just, when they told me the rate, I don't know.
What was she paying as the interest rate?
27%.
Yeah, that's credit card interest rates, and that's what they're doing. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau identified that poor people, and particularly poor black people, were being hit with these obscene interest rates, and they actually started recovering money from these companies. So the companies went out and spent $5 million to buy senators, and they just got this thing passed that forbids the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from, from continuing to protect us.
Yep. Now, she's been in this car loan for 2 years, like a $15,000 loan, and there's not even barely $1,000 paid off.
Yeah.
Because of late
was she is she a person of color, or was she a poor person? I mean, what?
She's a beautiful young African American girl.
Yeah. Okay. So there you go. I mean, this is yeah. Go ahead, Judd.
Yeah. I'm in love.
That's sweet. That's sweet. Well, help her get her car refied, and good luck.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to refi something that has a $14,000 principal. And you look it up on KBB, and the trade-in value is $6,000.
Oh yeah, that is a challenge.
Yeah, I'm gonna do what I can. Might have to just put her into something new with my name on it.
Yeah, because otherwise, this is another example of how poor people and people of color are also stuck into multi-generational debt, or at least throughout their lifetime debt. She buys a car for $20,000, gets a $20,000 mortgage or loan on it, but the interest rate's so high that she's never paying down the principal. So 4 years later, when the loan expires, she still owes $20,000, and the car is now worth $3, or $2.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. It's wrong. Is what it is. It's wrong.
Yeah.
Judd,
Sure
thanks for the call, and good on you for being a good boyfriend there, or friend. Eugene in Laplace, Louisiana. Hey, Eugene, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, how you doing?
I'm well. What's up?
Yeah, great. I'm glad you corrected that guy about slavery. Slavery always has been on the planet, but it was for one or three reasons: either religious reasons, the spoils of war, or debt. Slavery in the United States is the only slavery that was ever referred to as a peculiar situation. Peculiar, because the Africans did not owe the Europeans anything.
Right.
There was no religious persecution, no war. That's why it was called a peculiar situation.
Yeah. Well, and that was also the code that everybody kind of agreed on in the South to use to refer to slavery as that peculiar institution. Because I think you're right. I mean, the Romans, they expanded slavery as they moved across Europe, but they did it by conquering people. You're absolutely right. The Greeks, the same thing. The slavery that was even practiced by there were a couple of Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest that practiced slavery, but it was typically of that variety. It was the spoils of war. The idea of building an entire country's economy on slavery, virtually exclusively. I mean, an economy that would not or could not exist, or at least not with the vibrancy that it did without slavery. That's something that is unique to the American experience, as far as I can tell. Maybe I'm wrong, and Eugene, maybe somebody will call up and correct me, but I don't think this has ever been done anywhere else in the world. Back to you.
No, and it hasn't, because of the fact that slavery in the United States was called chattel slavery, that which was never referred to ever in the history of slavery around the globe. Now, you take, for instance, like in Europe or in in the times of Paul, Apostle Paul, slaves were treated like family members. They dressed well, they ate well, they was treated like family members.
Well, let's be careful about engaging in revisionistic history on this one too, Eugene, because we don't really know, and the odds are if somebody's a slave, their life is crap.
Yeah, but at the same time, some of them volunteered to stay in it because of the fact that they was treated well.
Well, that's because my understanding of, from having read Gibbons on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, is that some people wanted to be Roman slaves because that was better than, if you had no possibility at all to be a Roman citizen, at least you weren't homeless and hungry. But and that argument has been brought forward to say, oh, well, this chattel slavery in the United States, hold it. But it's a completely different thing. It was a different social structure. It was different political structures. There was a different concept of citizenship. There were very few actually Roman citizens, relative to the size of the empire. So it was a it wasn't like in the United States where, the majority population are citizens. And so, those kind of parallels can be real dangerous. But anyhow, Eugene, well said. I need to move along, but thanks for the call. Pam in Chicago. Hey, Pam, you wanted to talk about the Starbucks arrest.
Absolutely. Just looking at that video, Tom, and thank you for this conversation and your honest discussion as a white man on this issue. I just, wish you could write something that would educate the rest of the white community, as we phrase it. Yeah. But I saw the pain, Tom, on those men's faces and the look, he just had, like, here we go again. Yep. So.
Well, at least he wasn't shot, right? And that's a horrible commentary on the state of American policing. But I'm sure that there are, in the back of that guy's head are those two guys who got hauled off. I'll bet at least one of them was thinking, well, at least I didn't get shot. And that's bizarre. Excuse me,
exactly. Pam. And then, Tom, when you saw the white gentleman, their friend, come in and was combative with the police, said, well, why are you arresting them? Are you arresting them because they're black? They're just here meeting me. Now, had that been a black person to do that, they would have been arrested for obstruction of justice.
Yep.
So, Tom, let me just talk about the enslavement of black people, because I don't think people understand. This country has profited from the enslavement of black people and others and racism. And we always want to ask, well, what would reparations look like? How can we bring fairness and justice? And this is what I say to the white community, Tom. We need exactly what the white people in this country received to make us whole. And am I clear about that, Tom? We need a period of time where we're given land, where we're given access to banking, financing, where we're given the opportunity to have no competition for the myriad of jobs in various industries. Now, I know it's not likely we'll get that, but what I'm asking the white community to understand is what made them whole as a community? What programs and services and legislation helped them? That, in turn, is what we need. And last, does that make sense, Tom?
It does, and I just wanted to add it real quickly because we're going to hit a break here shortly, Pam.
Oh, sure.
But we can go back to the first 300 years or 400 years of the United States, or of the North America's history. But when my dad came back from World War II, he was able to go to college on the GI Bill and buy a house on the GI Bill, and his colleagues who were in the military with him during World War II who were black couldn't. I mean, this is not some ancient thing.
And that's all I'm saying. And, Tom, lastly, I'm going to leave you with this. Tom, I don't want to promote someone, but I'd like to, here in Chicago, we have a Mr. Salim Wakil who has a radio show on Saturday. I'd love for you and he to have a dialogue with each other. He is along the lines of the Black Eagle, right?
Of Joe Madison, yeah. Is he on WCPT, Pam?
No, he's not. He's not, okay. At least not yet.
Okay.
But he has been an invited guest on those shows.
I will check it out. Pam, thank you for the call, and thanks for the suggestion. Generally speaking, we ask people who want to make show suggestions to just share that information with Arthur. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We're going to check in with Talk Media News in about 4 minutes, find out what's going on in the world, and then, more great show? And welcome back. Jan in Shoreline, Washington, listening on KBCS. Hey, Jan, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
As a nearly your age white woman married to an African-American, and I didn't think I would cry right away. Racism, is what this country is built on. When the Civil War was over and there was briefly a period of time when African Americans were starting to, gain. And then the KKK was created and lynching started. And the terror that imposed on people, the children of those adults who had picnics around lynched adults or lynched human beings. Those children grew up to be the adults who were spitting at and screaming at African American children trying to go to school in Little Rock.
In the 1950s.
Those adults, those children, grew up to be the adults who pulled a gun on a 14-year-old the other day because he was asking for directions.
Yep.
The children of those people, our age people, are the adults now who called the police about two African-American men sitting quietly in a Starbucks waiting for their friend.
Yep.
This racism is what is so devastating to this country.
I would call it a cancer in our society, Jan. And it's a cancer that needs to be excised. When you have cancer, you don't sit around saying, gee, should I take an aspirin? You don't say, gee, I need to learn more about this. You get the damn thing out. You know, you nuke it, you kill it, you declare war on cancer, right? And racism in our society, in the United States, is a cancer. And I think we can identify it as a cancer. You know, to extend that metaphor, you know, cancer typically begins with one cell going nuts. It starts out, you know, with one cell having a change in its DNA so that it starts, you know, reproducing without control, and eventually takes over and destroys the entire organism. And this cancer of racism started with the conquest of North America, the way that it was done. You know, the first slaver in North America was Christopher Columbus. He took Taino Indians back to Europe as slaves. And he wrote a letter to the King of England saying, you know, a slave is more valuable than gold. And this continues to infect us, and it is killing us, and it has been for years and years, for throughout the history of this country. And we have to figure out how to get past this.
And Tom, and it's so deep that studies have been done over the years with 4- and 5-year-old kids of different ethnic groups, African American kids and white kids, given a doll to choose. Which doll do you want to choose? And if it's just given like that, the black kids will often pick the black doll. But when they're asked which is the good doll, they almost 100% pick the white doll. And when asked why, it's because that's the good doll.
Right.
That's how embedded it is in our society.
Yeah, these are the lessons of what Daniel Quinn calls mother culture. This is the soft, subtle, very faint but very real voice that our culture whispers in our ear. By our, I'm talking about, well, I was going to say white people, but it whispers it in the ear of everybody. I mean, these ideas of inferiority are built into all of us. Jan, thank you. Thank you for the call. Let's check in with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. This report brought to you by Goats for the Old. Goat.com, Ellen Ratner's charity out of South Sudan, and her new book, Loving What You Do, available in bookstores and fine outlets all over the internet and everything else. Ellen Ratner on the line with us. Hey, Ellen.
And I'm in a country that you've been to, and you just talked about South Sudan. So there you have it.
Whoa, you're calling in from South Sudan. What's the situation there right now?
I am.
You know, it was 8 years ago last month that you and I were there together.
That's right. What the situation is, you know, it's hard to know. I mean, I see it as the same as it always is, but I only go to certain places, and I go to the hospital, and then I go up to northern part of Ghazal where we were, and that's it, you know. So who knows, right? Yeah. And this heart I'm wearing is made by, of course, women up there in northern part of Ghazal who've seen somebody killed in front of them, and we have our psychiatric hospital here in Juba, and that's what's going on. But there's a lot going on in the world, so let me go through some of that.
Okay.
First of all, it is interesting that the president is going to have their first state dinner for the president of France, Macron, and that is going to be happening on April 24th. 3 days later, he is going to welcome Angela Merkel from Germany, but not a state dinner, to the White House. So that is going on. The IRS, by the way, today extended their deadline to the end of today because their website crashed. People are trying to pay their taxes or file their tax reforms, their forms, and the website crashed. Can you believe it?
Yeah.
Hard to believe that they didn't anticipate.
Well, I guess they get about 5 million a year, or a day. I mean, on that last day.
Yeah.
So that's pretty massive.
It's crazy, right? But they didn't plan for that. Meanwhile, speaking of not planning, the White House Budget Director, Mulvaney, is taking a look at Scott Pruitt and his EPA various expenses, so we say. And so that is going to be looked at what some people would say at a higher level than the EPA Inspector General.
Oh, let me add something here, Ellen. A number of the recent budgets passed by Republicans, including this last one, but I mean, this goes literally back to the Reagan and Bush administrations. The Republicans have been consistently defunding the IRS, and to the tune of millions of dollars a year that they're cutting out of the IRS budget, forcing them to lay people off, forcing them to back things up. And I think that if the IRS's website is crashing, that didn't happen in a vacuum. That the Republican defunding of the Internal Revenue Service, because they represent rich people who don't like to be audited, is really what's going on here. Back to you.
I like your analysis. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Now, this is really interesting. Barbara Bush, as you know, died, and her husband apparently was there with her holding her hand. However, most people don't realize that her sister's children were the Raffertys, and they made that very famous film that I know you've seen, American, it's the movie about what happened, and I'm blocking on the name of it, and I even have it written down. But anyhow, it's the movie that was made about the nuclear Atomic Cafe.
Oh, Atomic Cafe.
All right, Atomic Cafe was made in 1982. Wow. That was made by Barbara Bush's two nephews, her sister's children. They were more lefty than you and I, if that's possible. And now the Library of Congress in 2016 took American Cafe and put it into one of its iconic American films.
That's great. Atomic Cafe. That's great. It is a remarkable movie.
That's right. Okay. Now, the president is about to have a lunch with none other than Prime Minister Abe from Japan. He's doing that at Mar-a-Lago. And then they're going to do a joint press conference at 6 p.m., and then they're going to have a social dinner. So far, we know that they have not talked about trade, and that although the White House press secretary said that they don't give the CIA director's schedule out, we do know, because the president tweeted about it, that in fact the head of the CIA, who is now destined maybe to be head of the State Department, actually went to North Korea over Easter weekend.
Wow. Yeah.
Shocking.
Yeah.
Absolutely shocking.
Yeah, Mike Pompeo.
My view is, and I know everybody thinks I'm completely crazy, but I think that they're both gearing for the Nobel Prize. I do. And I think they'll come up with something so they both get the Nobel Prize.
Trump and Pompeo?
No, Trump and Kim Jong-un.
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And frankly, you know, they might even deserve it if they can pull this thing off.
If they can, right.
Yeah.
We'll see.
It's a big if.
Now, I know you had somebody talking about, you had a caller just talking about the Starbucks situation in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. Well, Starbucks is going to close all the Starbucks for one day on May 29th so they can do training.
Yeah. This is a good thing.
If you can vote.
Yeah.
I think it actually is a good thing, and I think it is about time.
Yeah.
So let me just read my notes here. I'm having a little trouble reading
We're
them.
hitting the break here, Ellen. That's okay.
So also, okay, there you go.
We're out of time. Ellen, stay safe there in South Sudan, please.
Thank you. I wish you were here.
I wish I was too, and give my very best to anybody that we mutually know. I really enjoyed my time there,
Okay.
as difficult as it was. Ellen Ratner with Talk Media News, goatsfortheoldgoat.com. Thank you, Ellen. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. This is from the introduction. It starts with love, exchange, fellowship. It ends as it begins, in motion, in between various modes of being and belonging, and on the way to new economies of giving, taking, being with and for. And it ends with a ride in a Buick Skylark on a way to another place altogether. Surprising, perhaps, after we have engaged dispossession, debt, dislocation, and violence, but not surprising when you have understood that the projects of fugitive planning and black study are mostly about reaching out to find connection. They are about making common cause with the brokenness of being, a brokenness, I would venture to say, that is also blackness, that remains blackness, and will, despite all, remain broken, because this book is not a prescription for repair. If we do not seek to fix what has been broken, then what? How do we resolve to live with brokenness, with being broke, which is also what Moten and Harney called debt? Well, given that debt is sometimes a history of giving, at other times a history of taking, at all times a history of capitalism, and given that debt also signifies a promise of ownership but never delivers on that promise, we have to understand that debt is something that cannot be paid off. Debt, as Harney puts it, presumes a kind of individualized realization to a naturalized economy that is predicated upon exploitation. Can we have, he asks, another sense of what is owed that does not presume a nexus of activities like recognition and acknowledgement, payment and gratitude? Can debt become a principle of elaboration? Moten thinks economic debt, Moten links economic debt to the brokenness of being in the interview with Stefan Shukatis, who he acknowledges that some debts should be paid and that much is owed, especially to black people, by white people. And yet he says, I also know that it is, that what it is that is supposed to be repaired is irreparable. It can't be repaired. The only thing we can do is tear this stuff down completely and build something new, end of quote. The undercommons do not come to pay their debts, to repair what has been broken, to fix what has been undone. If you want to know what the undercommons wants, what Moten and Harney want, what black people, indigenous people, queers, and poor people want, what we, the we who cohabit in the space of the undercommons want, it is this. We cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, dismantle, tear down that structure right now. That right now limits our ability to find each other, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know live outside its walls. We cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we have torn stuff down, we will inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. What we want after the break will be different from what we think we want before the break, and both are necessarily different from the desires that issue from being in the dark. Let's come at this by another path. In the melancholic and visionary 2009 film version of Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, 1963, Max, the small seeker who leaves his room, his home, his family to find the world beyond, finds a world of lost and lonely beasts, and they promptly make him their king. Max is the first king the wild things have had, whom they did not eat, and who did not, in turn, try to eat them. And the beasts are the first grown things that Max has met, who want his opinion, his judgment, and his rule. Max's power is that he is small while they are big. He promises the beasts that he has no plans to eat them, and that this is more than anyone has ever promised them. He promises them that he will find ways through and around, and will slip through the cracks and re-crack the cracks if they fill up. He promises to keep sadness at bay and to make the world with the wild creatures that roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. That Max fails to make the wild things happy or to save them or to make the world with them is less important than the fact that he found them and he recognized in them the end of something and potentially the path to an alternative in his world, or an alternative to his world, excuse me. The wild things were not the utopian creatures of fairy tales. They were the rejected and lost subjects of the world Max had left behind. And because he shuttles between the Oedipal land where his mother rules and the ruined world of the wild, he knows the parameters of the real. He sees what is included and what is left out. And he is now able to set sail for another place, a place that is neither the home he left nor the home to which he wants to return. Moten and Harney want to gesture to another place, a wild place that is not simply the leftover space that limbs real and regulated zones of polite society. Rather, it is a wild place that continuously produces its own unregulated wilderness. The zone we enter through Moten and Harney is ongoing and exists in the present, and as Harney puts it, some kind of demand is already being enacted, fulfilled in the call itself. While describing the riots of London in 2011, Harney suggests that the riots and insurrections do not separate out the request, the demand, and the call. Rather, they enact the one in the other. The book is The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study. Everything into one. Morgan, Lewis.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's the Thom Hartmann Program, talk media for the sane among us, exposing the con in conservative here 5 days a week. The IMF on Wednesday sounded an alarm. This, I mentioned when we started the show a couple hours ago that in the third hour I wanted to get into this issue of debt And I'm just going to riff on this a little bit, and then we'll pick up your phone calls and continue with the other news of the day, and we can talk about, Michael Cohen, apparently is how he pronounces his last name, or Mike Pompeo, and what's up with North Korea, or what's going on with Syria, or racism in our media and our schools, or any of the other things that we've touched on today. But this is the kind of story that people who read the Financial Times, which is not your average person, it's, the Financial Times focuses on fiscal and financial issues, both governmental and corporate, and it's I don't want to say that it's the rich people talking to the rich people, but there's a large piece of that there, right? And stuff that happens in the Financial Times doesn't usually go much farther. I mean, it's because it is this kind of rarefied world of finance. But it impacts all of our lives. And if you think it doesn't, just think back to how your life changed, or at least was pressured, in 2009, 2010 as a consequence of the Bush crash of 2008. Or for that matter in 2008, because it really happened at the beginning, in the middle of the year. In fact, you could argue that it actually started toward the end of 2007 as the subprime mortgage crisis really began to unravel. So what took us down in 2008 was debt. What took us down in 1929 was debt. Now, back in 1929, most people didn't have home mortgages, although there were a number of mortgages out there, but the standard mortgage in 1929 was a 5-year balloon payment. So you buy a house for $5,000, which is, that's what dollars were worth back then, right? You buy a house for $5,000 and you get a $4,000 loan on it that at the end of 5 years you pay off in full, and every month for the, going up to that 5th year, you're just paying interest on it, basically. They were just like, they were balloon payment mortgages. And the reason that those were problematic is because when the real debt crisis, which took us down in 1929, which was people borrowing against their stock so that they could borrow, borrowing money to buy stock. So they'd go into the stock market and they'd say, hey, I want to buy $1,000 worth of stock. I'm going to go to a stockbroker and say, give me a margin call, or give me a margin limit here. I'll put up $100. You give me $1,000 worth of stock, and if I make a profit, I pay you back the $100 out of that. And if I make a loss, it's I'm on the hook for the whole thing. And what happened was when the market started declining, people had to pay off their stock, their margin calls, and they couldn't afford to, and then they couldn't afford to make their mortgage payments. And so you saw a dual collapse, the stock market and the housing crisis and the housing market in 1929, 1930, 31, 32, during those 4 years of the Republican Herbert Hoover administration. That's how that played out. And it's pretty much exactly what happened to a large extent, except in 2008, except instead of being driven by household debt, instead of being driven by people having borrowed money to buy stocks, it was driven by people having borrowed money to buy houses, because the housing mortgage landscape in 2008 was just completely a radically different thing from 1929. But the bottom line is that it's debt that was responsible for the last two big crashes in the last century, or the last century and a half, or however long you want to take it. So here, two mind-boggling articles on the front page of the Financial Times today. And no, I have no relationship with the Financial Times at all. They are not an advertiser. But these two articles, the one is like, uh-oh, look out, look out. And the other one is, isn't it cool what the banks are doing? So let me just share these with you. The first article, which was at the top of the Financial Times this morning when I read it, I'm not sure if it still is, but it was there then. The headline, it's by Chris Giles in Washington, D.C., and the headline is IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund, right? The bankers. The IMF sounds alarm on excessive global borrowing. And then the subhead, which should give you chills, was with $164 trillion owed, the world is deeper in debt than at the height of the financial crisis. That would be 2008, 2009. The IMF on Wednesday, Chris Giles writes, sounded the alarm on excessive global borrowing, warning that with a total of $164 trillion owed, the world's public and private sectors are deeper in debt than at the height of the fiscal crisis, the financial crisis a decade ago. Global debt is now more than twice the size of the value of goods and services produced every year. So we're at 225% of global GDP is the amount of global debt, which is, by the way, 12 percentage points higher than the previous peak, which was in 2009. And half of that debt, that $164 trillion in debt, is three countries, the U.S., Japan, and China. China, by the way, went from 1.7 trillion to 25 trillion. But if we're looking at 106 or half, if we're looking at $82 trillion in debt, the rest of it is the United States and Japan, particularly the United States. And in fact, the IMF called out the Republican tax scam. This is, again, quoting from Chris's article here in this morning's Financial Times. The IMF singled out the Trump administration's tax cuts for criticism since they left the U.S. with a deficit of 5% of national income into the medium term and a persistently rising level of debt in GDP. And then they talk about how, you know, the Trump administration says, don't worry, we're going to stimulate the economy on our way out of this, and nobody's buying it. It was interesting. I saw Stephanie Ruhle this morning on MSNBC. I'm pretty sure it was this morning. And she was talking to Hugh Hewitt, you know, the Salem radio right-wing talk show host. And she's like, you know, boy, you know, the debt is going to be exploding, you know. And he's like, well, government revenues are going to continue to go up, you know, which is, of course, true because the economy is continuing to grow, so they're projected to go up. Plus, inflation is decreasing the value of the dollar. So every budget is bigger than the last one, pretty much regardless of where taxes are at. But what he was doing was just gaslighting her. I mean, I was sitting there going, oh, my God, you know, Hugh Hewitt gaslighting Stephanie Ruhle, and they're both on the same network. So anyhow, that was the first piece. The top story in the Financial Times. Look out for debt. Then, you know, they have the top story, and then there's three stories underneath that, and one of the three was Wall Street's biggest banks eager to woo customers with credit. In other words, the IMF comes out and says, we've got a problem that could bring down the world economy, too much debt in the United States. And the bankers in the United States respond to this by going, hoo-hoo, more money. This is Alistair Gray and Ben Lannenham in New York wrote this article. And in a positive mood, which comes amid a loosening of regulations that bankers have long blamed for constrained lending, Wall Street's biggest banks are eager to woo customers with credit cards, car loans, and other products. But as many report provisions for future credit losses, critics point to the risk of mounting non-performing loans if households rack up ever more debt, a problem that will be exacerbated as interest rates rise. And, you know, which is absolutely true. More and more people borrow more and more money. What happens is interest rates are going to go up, and then people can't afford to pay it back. And then they've got a great graphic in here that shows where the largest amount of rapid recent growth in debt is. And surprise, surprise, student loans and car loans. They add, by the end of last year, household debt balances were $473 billion higher than the previous peak in 2008, according to the Federal Reserve. So this is not good news. And they say this is particularly a challenge for low-income consumers and younger borrowers. They have, quote, not substantially benefited from the nation's economic expansion or income growth over the past several years. Weaknesses in these two groups will drive higher credit losses at some stage over the next few years. In other words, as long as we keep basically, you know, our economy, our country's economy, as long as we keep sticking it to young people by jacking up their debt, sticking it to new families, you know, by freezing wages, essentially, ever since Reagan changed the economic landscape of America, we are setting up the next crash. Finally, from my Aiden Forecast daily newsletter, the Daily Pfennig by Chuck Butler, he writes, this is from his Dow Theory letters, he writes, there are three stages of debt. And he's quoting Hyman Minsky, who was a brilliant economist who has now passed on, but just an amazing guy. If you haven't studied Minsky, you really should. He says, Minsky believed in a theory called financial instability hypothesis, which says that lending goes through three distinct stages. I'm quoting now from Chuck's, this is a daily newsletter for investors. He called them the hedge, the speculative, and the Ponzi stages. And then Chuck Butler notes, you won't believe how similar this is to now. During the first stage after the crisis, banks and borrowers are cautious. Loans are made in modest amounts with borrowers known to be able to repay. As confidence grows, banks begin to make loans in which borrowers can only afford to pay the interest. The collateral on the loan is usually an asset that's rising in value. That's the speculative stage. And then the Ponzi stage begins. At this point, banks make loans to firms and households that can afford to pay neither the interest nor the principal. This is done according to the idea that the asset that's used as collateral will continue to rise in value. When the asset held as collateral stops rising, the loan is called, and thus begins a very bad circle of foreclosures, failures, and bailouts. And then he references the Minsky moment. And he said, this occurs when the Ponzi stage of lending is in place. Everybody's complacent with the situation. The asset held as collateral is still rising, and the borrower even adds to his debt because this stage can't ever end, right? And then, of course, they start losing value. And Chuck Butler is correctly pointing out, we are now at the Ponzi stage of lending in our economy as the Republicans are aggressively deregulating banksters and refusing to prosecute banksters, although that's something that is, bipartisan, for the crimes that they've committed up to this point. This is not a good thing.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with your calls and more of the news of the day right after this. And welcome back. Kevin in Mountain House, California. Hey, Kevin, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Second time.
Hey, Kevin, can you take me off the speakerphone? It's hard to hear you.
Yes. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
The second time calling. Thank you for taking my call.
Kevin, if you called and you got on the air before, I'm going to have to take you off the board. We allow people to call in once a week.
No, I mean, I called you like 2 months ago.
Oh, I see. Okay, my apologies.
Sorry, that's okay. I'm very concerned about what's going on with everything that would normally be in a normal world, extreme criminal activities with our dear leader. And yet I keep reading opinion pieces in different magazines, newspapers, whatnot, that nothing is going to stop them. And I just wanted to know, like I read It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis,
right,
but it did happen here. So I just wanted to know what you think, if there's any chance at all that he's ever going to be taken down.
Looking at the political landscape right now, I am of the opinion that if Donald Trump runs for re-election in 2020, and he almost certainly will if he's still alive and he's not in jail, which are two, not unreasonable caveats. The guy's in his 70s, he's obese, and he has, high cholesterol. On the one hand, and not that I'm wishing anything ill on him, but, we just have to face reality. And on the other hand, he's looking at numerous criminal charges, and numerous of his associates have already been prosecuted or even pled guilty to these crimes. But if neither of those two things happen, and if he's still alive, and if he's still is still free of jail, and there's not a sort of Damocles hanging over him of any great consequence, I believe he'll get reelected.
Yes, and that's not a very optimistic.
Now, the one thing that I think that could blow that up is if the Democrats run a genuine progressive against him. Yeah, Elizabeth Warren, in my opinion, would take down Donald Trump. Bernie Sanders would take down Donald Trump, although Bernie has kind of had his time, and he's also going to be, I think he's a year or two older than Donald Trump even. So that's going to give some people pause. But a serious progressive and a Democratic Party that embraces progressive values and actually runs on the things that Sarah and I were talking about, that all these young people are gung-ho in favor of. There's just this complete list. That could beat Donald Trump. Because, and I almost interrupted her when she was going through it, because in large part, Donald Trump ran, he said, I'm going to get you health care that's cheaper than Obamacare, and everybody's going to be covered. That's a progressive position. He said, I'm going to get you, free college education, or we're going to get college education costs down to where anybody can go to college. That's a progressive position. He said, I'm going to change the rules of the game of trade so that, companies are incentivized to either keep their business in the United States or bring it back home. That's a progressive position. And that's why Donald Trump won. And when the Democrats figure this out, they're going to start winning elections. Back to you, Kevin.
Well, okay. Well, thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate your opinion. And I will continue, as always, watching your show. I really appreciate everything you have to say.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for your kind words, and thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. And this is the worst case scenario, frankly, because I think a second Trump administration would feel, I think at that point Donald Trump would feel like he's got nothing to lose. He can't run for re-election. It's anything goes. He can do whatever he wants, and that could be very dangerous. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Coming up on 23 minutes past the hour, it's the Thom Hartmann Program, your media support group for We the People. Dave in Hot Springs Village, Arkansas. Dave, what's up?
Hi, Tom. You've been talking about metrics and economics, and when I look back when I started investing in 1965, individual investors had 80% of the market. Today, it's about 23%. Now, that's a dangerous thing. Today, the institutions are trading on algorithms. There's no human involvement in
that's more than half of all stock market trades that happen on the New York Stock Exchange right now are done by programmed computers, basically, rather than human beings.
That's exactly right, and they trade in a lot of shares at once and make money on pennies of change. And they're the ones that are forcing the change. Furthermore, the individual investor is mostly involved because of his IRA or his 401k, and he has nothing to do with how his stocks are invested. So it seems to me that we're on a dangerous path. That plus the fact that the PE ratios today, if you
this is
want
the price-earnings ratio. This is the value of a stock or the price of a stock versus how much money it spins off in dividends or profits. Back to you, Dave. Sorry.
Well, that's right. They call it's price-to-earnings ratio. That's the definition. Today, you could argue that on the Dow 30, it's 31. Now, the average over time, going back to the beginning of the stock market, is about 16.5.
Right.
So it's almost double what it would be on average or the median, and that's a recipe for disaster right there. Now they keep records of trailing earnings, and trailing earnings are last year's fiscal year earnings.
Right.
They are expected earnings. A lot of people trade on that, and the difference between the two is rather large because they always give you optimistic estimates of what the earnings are going to be in the next year. And the chances are they won't be. As a matter of fact, the chances are better that they won't be. So all of this put together is an absolute recipe for disaster. What do you think?
I think you're absolutely right. It's why I wrote, in part, why I wrote that book, The Crash of 2016, which I think was just two years too early.
I read it.
Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I think they're probably 2 years too early, too, but it may not even happen this year.
Yeah. Well, in part because of the tax break.
But it just seems so inevitable.
Yeah, and the tax break is going to make it even worse because what the tax break has done is pushed you know, all these literally trillions of dollars into corporate profits and into the billionaires' pockets, and all that money then is used to buy back stocks, or billionaires investing in things, and the result of that is an artificial stimulus to the stock market that will probably last about a year. And I agree with you, Dave. I think that the crash may not happen this year, it may happen next year, although this is the longest bull market that I think has ever happened.
Well, it is. It's artificially supported.
Right, by the Fed and by these tax cuts.
Exactly. And, you know, billionaires don't go out and buy 200,000 pair of jeans at a time.
Right.
Only individual investors do that. You know, you get 500,000 people that need jeans, 200,000 of them buy them. Otherwise, they sell 20,000.
Yeah, consumers are the job creators. And that is a message that, you know, our media doesn't have.
Yeah.
Is that people buying things are what creates jobs. Dave, thanks a lot for the call. Great to hear from you. We'll be back. It's coming up on 28 minutes past the hour. It's the Thom Hartmann radio and TV program, the place where despair is not an option. We'll pick up more of your calls right after this. Stick around.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with more of the news of the day and your calls right here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Fair and only slightly unbalanced. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Elaine Pagel's book, The Gnostic Gospels. This is from chapter 3, God the Father, God the Mother. Unlike many of his contemporaries among the deities of the ancient Near East, the God of Israel shared his power with no female divinity, nor was he the divine husband or lover of any. He can scarcely be characterized in any but masculine epithets: king, lord, master, judge, and father. Indeed, the absence of feminine symbolism for God marks Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in striking contrast to the world's other religious traditions, whether in Egypt, Babylonia, Greece, and Rome, or in Africa, India, and North America, which abound in female symbolism. Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theologians today are quick to point out that God is not to be considered in sexual terms at all, yet the actual language they use daily in worship and prayer conveys a completely different message. Who, growing up Jewish or Christian tradition, has escaped the distinct impression that God is masculine? And while Catholics revere Mary as the mother of Jesus, they never identify her as divine in her own right. If she is the mother of God, she is not God the Mother, on an equal footing with God the Father. Christianity, of course, added the Trinitarian terms to the Jewish description of God, yet of the three divine persons, two, the Father and the Son, are described in masculine terms, and the third, the Spirit, suggests the sexlessness of the Greek neuter term for spirit, pneuma. Whoever investigates the early history of Christianity, the field called patristics, that is, study of the fathers of the church, will be prepared for the passage that concludes the Gospel of Thomas. Simon Peter said to the disciples, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman will make herself male, who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." End of quote from the Gospel of Thomas. Strange as it sounds, this simply states what religious rhetoric assumes, that the men form the legitimate body of the community, while women are allowed to participate only when they assimilate themselves to men. Other texts discovered at Nag Hammadi demonstrate one striking difference between these heretical sources and the orthodox ones. Gnostic sources continually use sexual symbolism to describe God. One might expect that these texts would show the influence of archaic pagan traditions of the mother goddess, but for the most part, their language is specifically Christian, unmistakably related to a Jewish heritage. Yet instead of describing a monastic and masculine God, many of these texts speak of God as a dyad who embraces both masculine and feminine elements. One group of Gnostic sources claims to have received a secret tradition from Jesus through James and through Mary Magdalene. Members of this group prayed to both the Divine Father and Mother, Quote, from thee, Father, and through thee, Mother, the two immortal names, parents of the divine being, and thou, dweller in heaven, humanity, of the mighty name. The end of the quote from the prayer. Other texts indicate that the authors had wondered to whom a single masculine God proposed, quote, let us make man in our image after our likeness, in Genesis 1:26. Since the Genesis account goes on to say that humanity was created, quote, male and female, some concluded that the God in whose image we are made must also be both masculine and feminine, both father and mother. How do these texts characterize the Divine Mother? I find no simple answer since the texts themselves are extremely diverse. Yet we may sketch out three primary characterizations. In the first place, several Gnostic groups describe the Divine Mother as part of an original couple. Valentinius, the teacher and poet, begins with the premise that God is essentially indescribable. But he suggests that the divine can be imagined as a dyad, consisting in one part of the ineffable, the depth, the primal father, and in the other of grace, silence, the womb, and mother of all. Valentinius reasons that silence is the appropriate complement of the father, designating the former as feminine and latter as masculine because of the grammatical gender of the Greek words. He goes on to describe how silence receives, as in a womb, the seed of the ineffable source. From this she brings forth all the emanations of a divine being, ranged in harmonious pairs of masculine and feminine energies. Followers of Valentinius prayed to her for protection as the mother and as the mystical eternal silence. For example, Marcus, the magician, invokes her as grace, in Greek the feminine term charis. Quote, may she who is before all things, the incomprehensible and indescribable grace, fill you within and increase in you her own knowledge. End of quote from the Gospels. In his secret celebration of the Mass, Marcus teaches that the wine symbolizes her blood. As the cup of wine is offered, he prays that grace may flow into all who drink it. A prophet and visionary, Marcus calls himself the womb and recipient of silence, as she is of the Father. The visions he received of the divine being appeared, he reports, in female form. Another Gnostic writing, called the Great Announcement, quoted by Hippolytus in his Refutation of All Heresies, explains the origin of the universe as follows. Quote, from the power of silence appeared a great power, the mind of the universe, which manages all things, and is a male. The other, a great intelligence, is a female which produces all things. Following the gender of the Greek words for mind and intelligence, this author explains that these powers joined in union and are discovered to be in duality. The book, The Gnostic Gospels, by Elaine Pagels. It's Viagra for your brain, the Thom Hartmann Program. Rick, in Seattle, Washington. Hey, Rick, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I'm homesick today, but luckily to catch you not covering this trial that's going before the Supreme Court today between the state of Washington, who unfortunately is taking the wrong course against native tribes here in the state of Washington.
This is over fishing rights, right?
I'm sure you remember the Bolt decision that gave the treaty rights to have to catch of salmon to the native people here in the state of Washington.
I do not, but I'll take your word for it.
Well, it's big here in the Northwest because we're having less and less salmon every year, and there's been fights since the 70s that Native American people have gone to jail over just trying to make sure that they
I have followed those over the years in the paper, yeah.
Right. Well, anyway, that was the Bolt decision that was that did that.
That was
anyway, right now,
U.S. Supreme Court.
In the Supreme Court today, our state Attorney General Bob Ferguson is going before the Supreme Court to argue that it's too hard for the state of Washington. It would cost us $1 million to remove barriers that are in the culverts, go underneath the roads here in the state of Washington. To make sure that salmon can get to their accustomed places, which is the language that Isaac Stevens treaty going all the way back, all the treaties back there in the 1860s said that Indians should be able to get their, be able to fish and hunt in their accustomed places, and so the culverts make that more difficult. $1 million is not that much, and I wanted to let
Is this
people
because
know that
culverts are diverting water?
there's barriers inside the culverts, like they try to keep debris, I guess, from going through or something
So
like
do
that.
the salmon spawn up through culverts? Is that what you're saying?
The salmon have to go upstream wherever they can. That's
Right.
what the salmon do. They want to go upstream and they want to lay their eggs and they want to give succeeding generations.
Sure.
There's fewer and fewer of them.
Sure.
Anyway, our state attorney general's name is Bob Ferguson, and his office number is 360-753-6200. I'll repeat that, 360-753-6200. And the message to him is to stand down and abide by the lower court rulings that have already said that they should replace the culverts with things that work.
Yeah.
And don't collude with this new Supreme Court to undermine the treaty rights of tribes that have been going back all the way since the 1860s here in the state of Washington.
Okay. Rick, I'm not sufficiently well informed to comment on this other than to say that it makes sense, and I've heard from you before. I consider you a credible voice. So, Rick, thank you for the call. Rudy in Atlanta, Georgia. Hey, Rudy, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. How you doing again?
I'm well. What's up?
I guess my question to white America is, what kind of future you want for your kids? Because I mean, as you said, cancer. Racism is a cancer, and it means death. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Over time, it kills the host. Yep.
Right. And I don't understand. How some white Americans just don't get it. And
well,
I'll be foolish to think that even most white people. It's just I have a 3-year-old, and when I think about her future, Tom, it makes me want to cry.
That's a tough one, Rudy.
And well, hey, it's a tough one, but I mean,
the problem that we have, Rudy, is that to extend this metaphor, sugar can cause cancer. I mean, that's one of the things that we now know, and the sugar that we have in our political culture is the use of race to win elections, something that Richard Nixon started very intentionally in the Republican Party in 1968, that Ronald Reagan picked up and ran with when Paul Manafort was running Ronald Reagan's Southern strategy, and then when Paul Manafort ran, him and Lee Atwater, his employee, ran the George Herbert Walker Bush campaign and came up with the Willie Horton ad, and then and now Donald Trump, Paul Manafort running Donald Trump's campaign, and suddenly Donald Trump is talking just like Richard Nixon, and we have literally an entire political party that is willing to constantly pour sugar down our throats to give us that sugar high without anybody pointing out that sugar will cause cancer.
Well, let me say this. This will be inherited. Since, in other words, when I do something stupid, I look over my shoulder. So what I'm saying is, white America as a whole need to wake up, because sin, it doesn't go away. It doesn't go away.
Yep.
I see Hispanic kids in my neighborhood, the young ones, and I can tell that they have something on their mind. I can tell when young black kids have things on their minds. I'm a 47-year-old black man in this country, and I see the pain in minorities. I see the pain. And these young kids, I don't see them letting this go. So you have to think 20 years from now how these young kids growing into adulthood, how they're going to handle dealing with, white people.
Yeah.
And it's just something, it blows. What I'm saying is, for a white person, a logically thinking white person understands that what goes around comes around, and it just blows my mind that, that enough, I'm not even going to say enough. I just don't understand how a political body of people can just accept this, knowing that this is not going to go away. I know that these people profit from this.
Yep.
But this is destructive at its core.
And they're continuing to do it, Rudy. I mean, as Carl Frisch pointed out this morning, $5 million was given to largely Republican senators to get them to pass a piece of legislation to stop the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from stopping the car loan equivalent of redlining by jacking interest rates up exclusively on people of color. I mean, it's like it's like it never ends.
This is bigger than money. No, this is bigger than money. So I didn't mean to, but this is bigger and stronger than money.
Yeah.
We're talking about a social structure.
You're right.
And money's not going to have anything to do with this when you get to it. When it really gets to when it really blows up. Money's not going to have anything to do with this.
We used to, back in the 60s, in the anti-war movement, one of the more common phrases was, the war always comes home. And the way that we saw the war coming home in the United States was homelessness, drug addiction, all that heroin that got brought back from South Vietnam and all that kind of stuff. We're seeing the same thing in Afghanistan and Iraq, all the PTSD and the wounds and everything. The war comes home. Well, white people have been waging a war on black people since 1609. And that war is going to come home, and arguably it has been coming home in small ways, left and right for centuries. But karma's a B word. Karma's a tough one, and if there's anything I could say to white people out there is, like, get your head straight. Just because of the amount of pigment somebody's got in their skin, or the color of or the shape of their hair or something like that. It has nothing to do with their humanity. It has nothing to do with their intelligence. It has nothing to do with their ability to feel emotion. We are all fully human here, and we damn well better start treating each other like we are, or the worst of humanity is going to start coming out. And it's going to come out in ways that are unpredictable and that are extremely destructive. Rudy, thank you for the call.
Thank you. Enjoy your day.
Yeah, you too. Good talking with you. And thank you for just laying it right straight out there. Wow. Okay, we're coming up. It's about another 10 seconds here. It'll be 44 minutes before the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls and the news of the day right after this. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's the home of the political revolution, the Thom Hartmann Program. Back with more right after this. Welcome back. See here, Bob in South Dennis, Massachusetts. Hey, Bob, what's on your mind?
Tom, that was such a valuable call with you and Rudy. Boy, he speaks my mind.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, Tom, you know how the U.S. Constantly criticizes countries for their lack of human rights, but I don't hear, and maybe I'm missing it, those countries coming right back to the U.S. about all the crimes against humanity against its own people.
Well, Cuba's been doing that for years. It's one of the reasons why we don't talk about Cuba. We would say, oh, you're suppressing human rights, and they'd say, hey, everybody in Cuba has a doctor and a dentist. Why not the United States?
Yeah. Are you surprised by that, Tom?
No. No, I know how this game is played.
Why do you think they're not coming right back and just laying it right in our lap?
Well, I mean, they do. It's just that the American press doesn't report on it. That's my point.
Yeah.
I mean, Cuba, Fidel Castro has been saying this, and he's passed along. Raul, in fact, Raul's stepping down today or tomorrow, I guess. But the Castro brothers have been saying this forever, and this is not to deify them. I mean, I would not want to live in a country where it's dangerous to be a journalist.
Right.
Although increasingly I do live in a country where it's dangerous to be a journalist, but I think that we have to be able to acknowledge our own failings rather than constantly obsessing on the failings of others. and pretending like we're, you know, pure as the driven snow, when just that, well, another probably old racist phrase, you know, when that just simply is not the case.
Right, right. Just, I know you've got other callers. Just very briefly, Frontline on PBS recently aired Jane Elliott's Brown Eye, Blue Eye experiment.
Oh, my.
I wish your listeners would check that out online. You can go online to get it. Frontline, PBS,
Great.
Jane Elliott, Elliott, one of the most valuable 60 minutes of TV anyone will see on racism.
Absolutely. I haven't seen that show, but I know about the experiment, and you know, it's
well worth seeing.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, Bob.
Thanks.
Appreciate the call. Thank you, Angela in Silver Springs, Nevada. Hey, Angela, what's up?
Well, I was calling today because this morning I was watching your program and you were talking about Wall Street bankers and how they've loosened up their credit lines. Well, ironically, I had to call and make my credit card payments this morning, and don't you know, one of them offered me a credit card increase. So I just wanted to say how valuable you are and that you do tell the truth on the TV. I don't always agree with some of the things you say, but I'm here to tell you today what you came out with. I was just really impressed. And the other thing I wanted to throw out there is I'm on the Stagecoach Advisory Board out here. It's a little subsection of the Valley in Silver Springs. And the sheriff out here seems to think that protection orders are overreach of the court. And
you're talking about protection against domestic abuse?
Well, the problem is he claims to be Republican, but in reality he's a libertarian, and he has admitted in the paper.
Oh, geez.
And he completely believes that any type of restraining order is just an overreach of the court, to the point we've had murders over it out here.
Wow.
Yeah. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there that, you know, this is what's happening in our country, and we need to make changes to it. And I'm trying to do my little small part on this little board, and eventually I'm going to run for another office. But we as the people that are, you know, just normal everyday people, I didn't think I could get it done. But, you know, there's things that are going on that are getting done, and it's citizens that are doing it.
That's marvelous. Angela, thanks for the story. And when you do run for political office, let us know. We'll help promote your candidacy. I appreciate the call. It's the True People's Media, the Thom Hartmann Program. Margie in Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin. Hey, Margie. Thanks for listening to Sirius XM. What's on your mind?
Tom. Raw Story just posted an article out of Auburn, Michigan, about a school that is 95% white that is currently having Confederate flag demonstrations against their 5% African population and treating the African Americans in truly horrific fashion.
Whoa.
Now, the worst part about this is the response of the officials. And I know that you normally do not like it being read, but it has to be read to be believed.
Okay.
City and school officials say they're monitoring the Confederate flag demonstration, but they say they can't do much about it. They're doing their legal constitutional duty, said the Mayor Lee Kilburn. I'm not saying I'm supporting it, for it, or against it, but people in this country have to start realizing that we tolerate all people's view. He added, that's what's talked a lot in Washington and other places, but not practiced. People have to grow up and need to respect other people's views. In other words, the African Americans need to start respecting and tolerating the racism being inflicted on them.
And Jews should tolerate and respect the Nazi swastika, etc. Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's no white comparison to this. I mean, literally, white people not only can't understand this, they don't have a reference for comparison, because it's like there wasn't a time when white people were the subjects of the victims of genocide, at least, you know, in the last 3 or 4 centuries, and so it's like you can't even wake these people up with an analogy.
And there's no place for these students to go because this would be an offense the federal offense about discrimination in schools.
Yeah.
But we have a Justice Department that doesn't care about civil rights, so these students have no recourse whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. Margie, thanks for the heads up on that. I'll have to go check it. You said it was on Raw Story?
Excuse me?
You said the story was on Raw Story?
Raw Story, yes.
Rawstory.com.
I encourage everybody to go read it.
I will check it out when we get off the air. Margie, thank you for that. Jane in Chicago. Hey, Jane, what's on your mind today?
Hey there. I basically had my taxes done, and it's awakening some things as far as investing as a senior is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
More and more robo-investing is coming into being, especially with the bigger houses. I don't know where you invest and if they do it, but I'm kind of taken back because we pay X number of dollars usually to the house if they're managing it, or we handle it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand there's some new changes in this new tax law that if you work with investments, the dollars that are going to be written off with your RMD has to come from the house that you're working with, and it's taken from the money that's there. So robo-investing and the new rulings that are coming into being are kind of fuzzy in my mind. Do you have any words of wisdom to share with us?
I don't. I'm a lousy investor, Jane. I don't think I've ever made money investing in anything other than our homes or or the businesses, the homes and businesses that Louise and I have jointly owned. So I'm not the guy to go to for investment advice. I would point out, though, that this new budget that was just passed by the Republicans includes a repeal of the fiduciary rule. The fiduciary rule says that if you hire somebody to invest your money, they have to honestly and transparently report to you not only what it's costing for the investments that they're buying. In other words, if they're buying front-loaded funds that give them kickbacks, they have to tell you about that. Not only that, but also under the fiduciary rule, they have to tell you that there are other options available that make them less money, make you more money. And now that that is gone, we're back into the wild, wild west, or where we were just 3 years ago, where there is no fiduciary rule, or maybe it was 4 years ago, whenever Dodd-Frank was passed, no fiduciary rule, and therefore your stock picker can just basically lie to you.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's frightening.
Welcome to Republican world. Jane, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. Excellent question. Curtis, I'm sorry I don't have the an easy, facile answer. Curtis in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Hey, Curtis, what's up?
Yeah, yes. Hi, Tom. Second-time caller, long-time listener. I really appreciate the knowledge you pass on to all of us.
Thank you, Curtis.
But I'll just be short. I was stricken by the article that was in USA Today, the opinion section, where it says "you say," and it's April 18th, today's issue, and remarkably, what you were talking about earlier, they should have left Starbucks when they were asked.
Oh, geez.
Statements like that, it wouldn't have been any problem, any difficulty if they just got up and left or waited outside. It's just a thought that some people have, and I shared it with my coworkers here in Albuquerque. I'm 70 years old, black, retired Air Force, and we have liberal talks, very open between blacks and white, and if you read that article and the people don't get the message, then I don't even try to explain it to them.
Yeah. Well,
so
and
that was very interesting.
This is the problem, Curtis. There is a substantial. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you very much for the call. There is a substantial cohort, a substantial portion of the white population, and I'm of the opinion that it's well over half, who are so. And by the way, the reason why I'm of the opinion that it's well over half, in fact, I think it might be over 80%, is because I was one of those people for probably half my life who are so embedded in their white privilege, who grew up in white neighborhoods, who had basically the only knowledge that they have of people of color, even relatively enlightened, would be watching George Jefferson on one of the old sitcoms. I mean, basically just, and don't understand what their privilege is. And don't understand, and therefore don't have the ability to empathize, because they literally don't understand what life is like for people of color in this country. And slowly folks are waking up, people of my age, certainly, and people in their 30s and 40s and 50s. I think, though, that the millennial generation is really jumping forward on this because it is such a diverse generation. And that's you know, that's the hope I have for my country, frankly. That's it. Fred in Bremerton, Washington. Hey, Fred, we got a minute till the end of the show. What's up?
Okay. I'm going to give you a challenge here. If you ever get there, I know you live in Portland. I live up here in Bremerton, Seattle, liberals. Ride around in your car with the windows down and blast Mexican music and see what kind of looks you get from people. And I can't speak one lick of Spanish. I do have it in my ancestry. It's in my blood, and I love the music, and it invigorates me. But just to listen to it, you look at the people around you in the cars when they hear it, they would rather listen to boombox stuff rather than listen to some, you know, foreign music. I think what you're any other kind.
I think what you're identifying, Fred, is the cultural component of racism. And, you know, the way people talk, the kind of music they listen to, the way that they dress, the way that they do their hair, there are, you know, there's a very real cultural aspect to this. And I realize, and Fred, thanks for the call. I realize some libertarians try to dismiss it by saying, oh, what you're really not a, or I'm not, you know, they would say, I'm not really a racist, I'm a classist, I like my class. No, it's racism. And you know, you can't cover that up or paper it over. Anyhow, thanks for a great day today. Hopefully my throat gets better tomorrow, and we'll continue. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you. If we want this country to work, we all have to be involved. That includes you. Get out there, get active, tag. You're it. I'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.